Thank you all for joining us so much today. And for everyone in the room, please take your seats. And to everyone online, welcome. We look forward to spending the afternoon with all of you and discussing how biotechnology can help us respond to climate change. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Minister Counselor Ali Abdi, who works at the U.S. Embassy here in Pretoria. Over to you, Ali.
On behalf of the Office of Agricultural Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Pretoria, it's a great honor for me to welcome you in person and online to this important program. I want to thank the organizing team who dedicated so much time and effort to this important program and to put it all together. This is a joint effort between the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service, Department of State, and CropLife. Special thanks to Amy, Dirk, Chantel, for all the work behind the scenes. We couldn't do it without you. Raising the awareness of the positive impact of agricultural biotechnology in mitigating and adapting to climate change, maintaining environmental sustainability while improving productivity is crucial. We all understand these challenges very well, but this needs to be communicated and demonstrated consistently. The United States Department of Agriculture continues to support the safe and appropriate use of science and technology to meet agricultural challenges and consumer needs worldwide. One of USDA's top priorities is the promotion of innovation and biotechnology by supporting their introduction to the worldwide marketplace. These technologies offer new options to farmers responding to market needs and environmental challenges. South Africa has historically been the leader, the regional leader, in the adoption of biotechnology, ensuring that new technologies continue to be developed and implemented by researchers based on appropriate science and risk-based approaches. Specifically, 27 genetically engineered plant varieties have received general release for commercialization since 1997. That's a great achievement. This places South Africa among the top 10 largest producers of GE crops in the world. As new innovative tools become available, especially in the area of genome editing, it's important to ensure that science-based regulatory environment exists, not technical barriers that stifle innovation. Agriculture, as we know, faces challenge of producing more food to meet the nutrition needs of a growing population, while coping with the impact of climate change. The extreme weather conditions, events that have occurred across the planet are a serious concern, making it harder for farmers to consistently produce crops in the face of increasing food security and environmental challenges. Most concerning of all, scientists warn us these extreme weather events will increase. More droughts, more floods, more fires, disease, and pests, all threatening the food supply both locally and globally. It's a scary thought, but very real. So how do we ensure that we build a resilient agricultural system that can withstand the shocks of climate change and avoid the grim future of hunger. Our hope lies in innovation, science, and biotechnology. At the same time, we must look at how we can fight against climate change as an industry and look at ways to improve environmental stewardship in agriculture. Today, we will hear from two panels who will discuss these issues and the role that biotechnology can play in helping to mitigate the impact of climate change, as well as protecting our environment. I would like to thank the speakers, moderators, and the audience for joining us, and I look forward to productive deliberations. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Peter Phillips, our keynote speaker. Dr. Phillips is Distinguished Professor of Policy and founding director of the Center for the Study of Science and Innovation Policy at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. He undertakes research on the economic and politics of bioscience innovation policy related to global food security. He was the founding member of the Canadian Biosafety Advisory Committee. He served on the Canadian Council of the Academy's expert panel on plant health in Canada and is the chair of the board of Genome Prairie and is on the expert panel on clean growth with Canadian Institute in Ottawa, Climate Institute in Ottawa. While Professor Phillips is coming to the stage, I'm delighted to introduce a video produced by CropLife on food security.
There is no planet B. We are all completely reliant on the environment we live in for basic life, but also for quality of life. It's our duty and our responsibility to safeguard our environment through careful resource management, but also by developing scientific solutions to maximize those resources.
I'm Professor Marijke Lawaskagni. I'm a professor in plant breeding, and we have the Saatchi Chair in disease resistance and quality of field crops. Myself and my family love hiking, so we love going on hiking tours and seeing nature and experiencing that. We live on a small holding where we also have a vegetable garden, so we love being outdoors and seeing plants and nature.
In protecting the environment, we have incredible tools at our disposal. Scientists are at the forefront of fighting climate change and resource depletion through innovative solutions.
Plant breeding is manipulation of plants, but it's all for the good of humans, but also for the good of the environment. For example, we are breeding by conventional breeding for resistance, for example, to insects and the resistance to diseases. What is the alternative is to spray a lot of organophosphates, which goes into the soil and which goes into the soil water, and that's very unhealthy for the environment. So we can prevent this by improving the crops and making them naturally resistant or tolerant to all kinds of pests and diseases. So we are doing a lot of work on biofortification, that is the genetic improvement of nutritional value of crops. So we are improving the zinc content, the iron content, some essential amino acids, and also things like provitamin A. And at the same time, we are looking at it in the context of global warming. So while we are doing the nutritional improvement, we are also looking at drought tolerance and heat tolerance of these cultivars that we are developing as well.
Continuous innovations in plant breeding contribute to sustainability by creating cultivars that require fewer resources like water and chemicals to produce enough food to feed the nation. These innovative solutions will ensure that future generations can enjoy food security while at the same time protecting the environment.
I've been at the university for some decades now, and the technology has changed hugely. All over Africa, you have conventional breeding programs now, but you also have the new technology like gene editing and things coming in all over Africa. We need to produce more food. We need to produce more safe food, nutritious food, food that can grow in very adverse conditions, which we are seeing happening all around us with climate changes. And if we can change those genetically, I think that is what we are all striving for.
Because we all care about the environment, our collective goal is to produce safe, affordable, nutritious food in a responsible, sustainable manner that preserves resources and protects the environment. For more information, visit croplife.co.za. CropLife, supporting responsible food production for a better future.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today and to start the broader conversation about where technology fits in a resilient, climate responsive food system that can ensure we have security of food for all peoples around the world. I belong to an institute in Saskatoon that's trying to use technology in various ways to do that. So I'll bring some of my work and the work of many of my colleagues around the world to give you a sense of what we know and what we don't know about how technology can support a climate resilient agri-food system. I'm going to talk about the topic in three ways. First, I want to talk about the challenges to agriculture and the food system. My slides keep returning to the starting point. Second, I want to then talk about agriculture as both part of the problem of the climate conversation and how it can be not just responding to that problem, but it can be part of the solution set. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the pathways for biotechnology and other technologies to actually improve the prospects for food in the 21st century. So let me start with the challenges to food itself. I mean, food security in many ways is both a very objective measure of people being able to eat enough to survive and thrive, but it's also very subjective in that it depends a lot on the mix of policies and structures. It's an enduring concern. It's, food in and of itself is probably the most basic need of humanity. It's a source of employment for about a third of the world's population. It still is the single largest industry. And malnutrition and famines impose massive economic costs when and where they happen. And they happen, hunger is not a developing world problem. It's in every country in the world. It just has different causes and different elements. Objectively, we've conquered that problem. We have enough food to feed everyone. But practically, we have major disconnects. About 11% of our population is now hungry, and it's projected that as population grows and as the climate considerations emerge, that we're going to need to increase volumes of production everywhere around the world to ensure that we can maintain adequate nutrition. Food security is very localized. As I said, it's everywhere, but sub-Saharan Africa is sort of the epicenter of the particular problem, and it's a growing problem there. Some other areas it's significant, but it's a declining problem. We solve the food insecurity in some ways by trade. We have countries around the world like mine, Canada, the United States, Australia, parts of Latin America, parts of Northern Europe, and Asia that are food exporting countries. They technically produce more food than they need, and they export it to countries that need it. The challenge we face is that today, without any further changes of environmental effects, many of us are under stress. You can see pretty much everything along the equator, above and below, up to about 30, 35 degrees north and south, has some risk attached to it. And some parts are significantly at risk. Lack of water, lack of other supplies. And even areas that are major exporters like Canada, Argentina, Australia, Argentina, are not without some concerns and pressures. And the climate itself will exacerbate that. This data is a little bit old, but as you can see that there's a few places like Canada and like the area I live in that we think production may actually be more, may have higher yields than it does under current conditions with the environmental changes. But virtually nobody else has that benefit. So most of the places that are food exporters are going to be having their own challenges of sustaining production. And that puts pressures on the world trading system. Interestingly, some crops are more resilient than others. I come from a world of wheat. Wheat is actually doing pretty well under this scenario, partly because it's located in climatic areas where the seasons will be getting a bit longer, the moisture will be more, but in bigger blocks of time. But over time, it will reduce the risk of crop damage. But as you can see in corn and soy, the risk rises almost monotonically in all three categories, whether it's small and modest yield challenges, medium and large challenges. So that's critical for the global food system. Those are foundational blocks to our diet. And some regions are particularly at risk. Once again, sub-Saharan Africa. It's the only part of the world that, under the projections in this case, will not be able to have available in their local ecosystem enough nutrition to feed everyone. Everyone else will have enough, but there will be imbalances locally, regionally, and continentally. So that's the challenge we have. And agriculture, as I said, is part of this climate conversation. And part of it's a problem set. It's contributing to climate. It's being affected by changes in climate, but also it may be part of the solution set. Agriculture currently represents somewhere between 15 and 25% of the national greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And the estimate is that approximately 18% of global emissions are coming from the agri-food sector itself. The emissions for agriculture have been pretty static for a while. They're not going up massively, but as a percentage of global emissions, they're coming down. They were up at 23, 24%. So they're down about 5%. Some of that's good practices that are evolving, and I'll talk a bit about some of those, but some of it's just that other sectors are emitting more and more as we exploit more of our carbon-based energy systems. Greenhouse gases have been particularly rising for animals production. It's not the focus of my discussion today, but it's inevitable when you talk about agriculture. We have to remember that animals are a critical part of the global food system, and they're producing approximately 2/3 of the emissions from the agri-food sector. So whatever happens in plants has to be replicated and managed within the animal system itself. GHG emissions are falling for plant production, and what's left, it might be hard to see, but what's left, you can see the blocks of what's there, but the blue box in the middle is fertilizers. Then you can see rice cultivation, crop residues, burning savannas for new crop areas, and sort of drained organic soils are the contributing elements. So there are still some significant contributions that science has to look at to see how we can mitigate and moderate and perhaps change the trajectory of the industry. The developed world is increasing efficiency and in some cases is getting to the point where we want the whole industry to be, but the rest of the world has to catch up in some ways. And so part of that's a policy challenge. And everywhere around the world, partly because of Glasgow, the focus is on one particular aspect of agriculture right now, and that's the role of nitrogen in the production system. And that looks to be low-hanging fruit, but it's problematic because nitrogen is a core part of the production and the productivity of the system. There's differential progress. Regional emissions are rising and falling in different areas. In the developed world, which is the small circles at the bottom, you can see in North America, Europe, and the Oceania, Australia and New Zealand primarily, emissions are flat to slightly down on fairly significantly rising yields. So per unit of output, emissions are down, but in aggregate, they're starting to drift down slowly. The challenge is that in most of the developing world, which is where the food needs are most intense, production is going up, but so are emissions. So they have not yet decoupled in terms of the production possibilities. So what can we do about that? One thing is we may not need much. At one level, we don't need a lot more technology to get to where we want to be. This is one example. We have corn. Corn has really advanced varieties and some native, right down to some traditional varieties. If you take the United States as sort of the cutting edge of where corn production is in terms of its productivity, which is the first line, then I won't focus on any of the countries, but you can see depending on the country, and some of them are quite significant producers, their yields are significantly less than the American yields. And so there's missed opportunities. Part of that's the technology isn't transferring into those areas, and when it is, sometimes the rest of the industrial system isn't supporting the productivity that's necessary. So there's a lot of potential with the existing technologies we have now. Now that's a single technology. When you put it all together, you can actually get into a win-win scenario. This is some work I did with some colleagues in Western Canada. We're a major producer of 3 dryland crops: wheat and durum wheat, canola, an oilseed, and lentils as a pulse. 20 some years ago, 1985, we had significant use of summer fallow. So fallowing the fields where we would leave the fields empty for a year in a rotation, usually 1 in 3. Reducing that and changing the technology, so adding new seeds, new chemicals, new machinery, new agronomy, new data, and ultimately moving towards zero-till technology has allowed the industry to go from a major net contributor of greenhouse gas to the environment to an actual carbon sink in the last 7 or 8 years that we were able to estimate. And so that's with existing technology. This is putting it together in ways that generates a win-win scenario. And the interesting thing is that nobody did that because of climate policy. They did because it was good economics and good agronomy. We were mining our soils, we stopped mining our soils. So at the beginning of that picture, back in 1985, 5% of our land was zero-till. Up to a third of the acreage was fallow in any one year. Now you would have a hard time finding a fallow field in my province, and 75% of it is zero-till, and everything else is pretty much conservation tillage of one sort or another. Now, it doesn't work perfectly everywhere. Our neighbors next door are wet. They can't use some of this technology, so they haven't had the gains in climate events. And this is before we've even talked about climate policy. This was just done because it was good agronomy. If and when we get our focus on good climate technologies, we should be able to do better than that. We should be able to reduce the nitrogen and other emissions from the industry as a whole. So let me move on from that's where we are. What we want is technology that will feed the world efficiently, effectively, and in a resilient way so that no matter what happens to the environment and the climate, we can respond in real time so we don't have these gaps in food availability and food use. The FAO has identified a whole long list of things that could and should be done to move us towards a more resilient and adapted industry, including seasonal change and sowing dates. We've seen that picture I showed you of the Saskatchewan results. We moved our most valuable crop from the end of the seeding period to the beginning of the seeding period because we no longer had to worry about weeds, because it was a Roundup Ready and liberally linked technology that was in the crop. So we went from the hottest time of the year to the coolest time of the year, and the area production doubled and the volume tripled. So that was simply just realizing we could move the product from one part of the year to the other without any corresponding loss in productivity in the other crops that are part of the rotation. We need different varieties and different species. 20 years ago, we didn't have commercial pulses that were available for large-scale use in Western Canada. Now it's our second or third largest crop on an annual basis. So we built up varieties that worked in multiple areas. We have a large growing area. We need at least 8 differentiated varieties for every trait to be able to serve the area effectively and efficiently. In the past, we used to produce 1, and that limited the uptake and use of technologies. We need better water supply and irrigation systems. Now, in our case, we don't irrigate. We're a bit like South Africa. We have a bit of irrigation, but it's for green vegetables and things. We rely on 15 inches of rain a year That's not very much, considering a third of it comes in the winter in the form of snow. And we had one of our worst years ever in terms of rainfall during season, and our productivity didn't drop a bit. And it's partly because the soil organic matter was so strong based on the changes in cropping patterns that even with such weak rainfall, we were able to sustain our productivity. Inputs, we need them all. Not just any one, we need to optimize, not maximize. We need to use them effectively, efficiently. And new crop varieties is the anchor to all of this. None of the story I tell you about Saskatchewan could have happened there without the efforts of multinational companies who worked on canola, without the efforts of public-private partnerships that worked on lentils, and without the role of the global wheat research system that has built a really resilient, modern wheat breeding program. And ultimately, fire risk management is part of this. Not a big deal in my part of the world. We don't get a lot of fire, but it is in many parts of the world. All of those need innovation. Not innovation in terms of technology, innovation in terms of ability to take up and use new ideas in ways that advances the productive capacity and the resilience of the industry. So it's not just about picking up a new seed or a new air seeder or a new machine. It's about putting it together in the context of the overall production system. So let me tell you the difficult story. The research system to get from a really good idea to something that people derive value from is brutal. It's absolutely brutal. This is some work done by my colleague Greg Graff at Colorado School of Mines. They did a study of 530 innovations that were disclosed in the public space. And you can see as the various steps it went through, by the time they were done, 2 of those, less than 0.4%, actually were sustained in the market. So it's a trivial number of great ideas that get there. Most of them, and it's not just that the regulators stop the world. Over 90% of them are culled by the inventors themselves. They look at it and say, yeah, I could do that. But does it really change the world? I mean, is it really adding much value? So there's a challenge here. It's a brutal system we're working at. It doesn't mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, because all those innovations I've talked about came through the system. So we don't need to make many tweaks to have a material gain in output. Imagine if you could just double or triple that 0.4 or 1% success rate. So how do we do that? Well, there's actually a corresponding pyramid of opportunity that goes along with that sieve. There's different ways we can do research. Increasingly, we're moving back to mission-led research. My research institute, the Global Institute for Food Security, is just that. They don't do one-off projects. They do large-scale projects with a mission attached to them. They want to transform some part of the breeding space. When it comes to all these gestational activities, figuring out whether these things can be adapted and adopted and used effectively in industries, before you get to the legal commercial aspects, that's where partnerships are involved. They're not just public-private. They're not just multinational companies getting together with governments. They involve producers. All of the success we've had in Western Canada had a producer component to it. Associations and checkoffs that maybe didn't put a lot of money in, but they put a lot of information in, and they became a credible voice for translating and transmitting this information as it was finally ready for the market. Regulatory harmonization innovation is part of it, and we're all part of that space. It doesn't move nearly fast enough. I was a trade policy negotiator once, and my minister used to say it's like watching paint dry as you go through watching a negotiation. But over time, the paint does dry, and we add new coats, and eventually we get something different. And ultimately, there's a potential here with some of the new technologies to narrow the break-even point for new technologies, and so that we'll end up with a higher success rate. Right now, we've constructed a system that's designed to deliver large-scale innovations, but a lot of the smaller stuff that could be really important for niche markets and for smaller markets just isn't getting through because the costs of the gestational process and the time is too high. So how do we get there? I'm going to talk about 4 different things. I think there's a little bit about the aspirational goals of the research space. There's definitely a role for more effort to make the regulatory system resilient. There's questions about how do we assist people to adapt and adopt technology. It's not as simple as the textbooks say or as the marketers tell you. And at the end of the day, there have to be winners. Somebody's got to win out of this, or it falls apart. And so I'll talk about each of those in a brief way. First thing is that this is a global industry. Last numbers I have show that about $70 billion, US dollars, were invested in research and development in the global agri-food space. About 65% public, private, 35%, it's 60-40 public-private. The public money is a bit upfront, basic research to farm level. The private money is differentially, it's up, some of it's up there, but differentially it's in the branded food space. It's trying to pull into the high value, high return parts of the industry. When I talk to those people and when I talk to the scientists that I work with internationally, they are talking 20 years from now. So when they talk from 20 years from now and what they think is driving large-scale capital flows at the nation-state level and at many of the multinationals, is that one way or another they fall into or overlap some of these three visions. One vision is that we get a seed industry that is machine learning, advanced, data-driven, that all the things that we worry about in our personal life as we use our electronic devices, that we apply those in the most positive way for agriculture. And so we move away from the bespoke, small-scale breeding programs, but to large-scale mechanized programs that reduce the cost and increase the speed. And so it's a mix of genomics and phenotyping, automated phenotyping, visualizations, big data mining. At the end of the day, the idea is to drive down the cost of discovery. Right now, the cost of discovery is a bit below 10% of the total cost of a new technology in the genetically modified space coming into the market, and about 13% of the time. That's about half the total cost it used to be 12 years ago. So these technologies are already starting to bring down the overall cost of production of those. The second one is the one that the farmers are particularly interested in, and that is making it work for farmers. So you produce something that's cool and going to generate some value to somebody in the industrial space. How do you make it work for farmers? And there, people call it different things, but essentially precision farming, optimizing everything, yields and inputs. And that's not at the field level. It's at some people say at the meter by meter level. Practically, they're talking about the 10 meter by 10 meter space. And so everything is differentiated enough to ensure you get the highest yield with the lowest cost, and you can very easily add climatic elements into that variable so that you're minimizing the effects or optimizing the benefits of the production system. It's sensing, it's drones, it's scripting, it's the whole bit. And scripting, so far, at least in trial space, with no change in input costs, just better management of what you use, is demonstrated to produce approximately a 6% return on investment. That's about the whole value of GM technologies. That's about all it's added to our productivity in agriculture. So just realigning what we can do is equal to the science effort that the industrial space has already done. So it could be a lot bigger as we move along because many of them aren't as efficient as the sectors that they're looking at, the farms they've been testing this on. Third one I won't spend a lot of time on, but certainly in places like Europe, parts of Asia, lots of North America, there's a real desire by the downstream data managers to move into food. You go to Silicon Valley, you go to the big branded food companies, you go to the online companies like Amazon, they're all saying that's an industry that's ready for disruption. How do we get in there and disrupt it? And their idea is that you'll be able to, in a trivial way, your refrigerator will tell you when you need a new product to be distributed. But more importantly, it will actually deliver what you want, not just what was in the machine. So the idea is that you'll get that pull through. Demand will drive supply over time. Nobody's quite cracked that one, but that's certainly the world that many people think we're heading towards in the developed world. So let's talk about the rest of these things. Regulation is a reality. It's necessary, but most of the regulatory effort we make is not necessary. It's excessive. It's a thicket. It's not just one country. Doesn't matter who you are, if you bring a product to market, you almost always have to think globally. The challenge I face as a scholar and a former practitioner of trade policy is we had a good system. We spent 100 years, agriculture was at the vanguard of trying to build an international science-based trading system. Dairy. They wanted to drive out bad dairy products, infected food products, and create efficient and effective trade. So all of this trade regime that we built, the free trade agreements, the WTO, and all of our other systems, were built on the background that food needs to be safe and nutritious and reasonably priced and tradable. Now we've gone back. GMOs, for some reason, triggered a nationalization of and a renationalization of a regulatory system. So everybody wants to have a say in it. The science is the same, but different governments will come to different judgments on what the science says and what risks it entails. And there's a problem with that. If we look at the GM crop space, we have two big problems, and three big problems. I'll talk to two here and one to come. One is that we only approve selectively what we want. So a lot of the things that have come to market are only approved for production in a few countries. Many of us will allow it for consumption, but not for production. Secondly, they're not all approved at the same time. For most products, there's a 3 to 5 year lag between the first approval and enough approval that you can actually internationally trade that product. For one product we've tracked, it took 20 years between the lead and the lag approver. So you've got to differentiate in the market, and that creates a coexistence problem that we can talk about in questions and discussion later. So we can manage the risk, but we get higher costs and lower success. The two studies done by CropLife International, the Phillips McDougall, and now the Ag Bio Investor, both show it's expensive to get a product to market. Over $100 million. It's coming down, but it's coming down because the science is making it cheaper. The regulatory costs are going up. And what's more important for firms is the time to market is doubled. The time to regulatory approval is doubled. That time is money to those enterprises, more so than in the public sector. And it varies a bit. Maize is most challenged. Other crops are less so. Cost duration, it depends on the various countries. There are opportunities to narrow this gap. It's not an impossible thing, and most of these are underway. We have international harmonization and standardization going on at the OECD, the WTO, usually through trade disputes, unfortunately, at the International Plant Protection Convention and the Cartagena Protocol. Each of them has challenges, but each of them is building an evidentiary base that is supporting the science-driven parts of the system. Public-private partnerships are core. The CG centers with the various multinationals and the national regulators are transmitting capacity to assess and regulate and approve these varieties in regions. We have national and regional agencies, sometimes through regional trade agreements, sometimes just through mutual recognition agreements. Canada and the United States are sharing dockets, so the companies don't have to produce the same docket twice to reduce the costs and overhead and burden of these things. Industry itself takes a key lead. I've got to know NAGA, the North American Grain Association, and they speak, I'm probably misspeaking, it was something like thousands of events of something found in the food chain that shouldn't be there, or somebody thought shouldn't be there. It need to be handled on an annual basis. And so they're very much part of managing this science-based system. Farm leadership's important, the commodity groups in particular. Our canola crew in Canada had a lot to do with sorting out a trade dispute with China a number of years ago. And academic leadership is sometimes valuable. The GM Coexistence Conference, which ran for a couple of decades in Europe and the United States, spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to manage and build across these solitudes of GM-free parts of the world. The good news of all this is that some of the technology may break down these barriers. The break-even size is falling for some innovations. Bullock produced a really interesting study a while back that said that with GM technology, the minimum break-even acreage over multiple years in any number of markets was about 60 million. That's a lot of seed sales. And usually it required, in most markets, multiple years or multiple markets to break even. And they calculated as long as the regulatory system is responsive, the gene-edited crops could break down the profit recovery period from 60 million acres to around 2 million acres. So all of a sudden, you've dropped 95% in terms of the break-even market size. When GM started, I used to talk to the multinational companies, and they told wonderful pie-in-the-sky stories. And I sort of characterized as 20-20-100. They thought they'd do 20 crops with 20 variety key traits in 100 countries around the world. They ended up, now they're talking 5-5-1. 5 crops, 5 key traits, 1 country that matters. If they can't make money in the United States on that trait alone, they don't do it. They will sell to other markets, but that's the dividing line. By moving towards a lower break-even point, we've got great potential to move past that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's critical to remember that adoption is not just, I've got the best mousetrap and everybody's going to beat away to my doorstep. It's not just about telling them, persuading them, having them make a decision, having them implement it, and they confirm it by consuming it, and then they come back and buy more. That's what the marketers tell you it's all about. The reality is there's an awful lot of debate about fitting technology in. That's that block 1. It's got to be trialable. It's got to be accessible in ways that people can buy small amounts and make it work. Secondly, it's got to be tested socially, and we found in GMOs that social restraint is a problem. And at the end of the day, it has to make money for enough people that they'll stay attached. And one of the critical parts of that is being able to move the technology in a practical way between the labs and the farmer. And seeds are critical. And one of the concerns we have in the world is that there's not much of a commercial seed trade. In North America, about 90% of the stuff that's planted is store-bought. So every year you buy the latest technology. In Middle East and Africa and Asia, more than 60% is bin run. It's farmer-saved seed. So you're using last year's technology or last decade's technology, which is why in that corn picture, there's so much of a gap between the leaders and the rest. And one of the critical things is the commodity groups. That second graph is Canada. We have a lot of bin run seed, especially in wheat. But notice canola, partly because of the science and the agronomy of canola. But the reason canola is so big and such a successful product is because we have an industry that got out there, the farmers got out there and sold it to themselves. And the adoption rates were very fast and significant. So I'm going to wrap up with the question of how do you keep this system operating? And how you keep it operating is people get something for their effort. This is one example. My friend and colleague Nick Kalasandonakis at Missouri and others, Julian Alston and others, did a major modeling exercise where they looked at the impact of the adoption of soybeans. You can see that anybody that adopted soybeans, producers got a share of it, so did the companies that produced the seeds. Anybody that didn't adopt it, the producers had more competition. They lost. The consumers all benefit because compared to otherwise, production was higher, prices were lower. Anything that's a competitor to soybeans, like canola, palm, and soy, the producers lost because they're competing against a more competitive crop. The consumers gained. Corn and wheat, the producers gained because wheat producers moved into soy. And so at the end of the day, the benefits transcend far more than the farmer who chooses to produce or not. They're spread worldwide to countries that aren't even part of the conversation. When you take this and add the other 5 or 6 major crops and all the different markets, there's a massive impact, only about half of it which stays in the food system itself. So the money is important, but there's more than money to these technologies. In many cases, they can be accessible to different kinds of producers. In the area of GM crops, a lot of farmers, over 90% of the farmers, were in resource-poor parts of the world. Farm incomes come up, and that allows the farmers to increase their nutrient intake and improve their household incomes. In countries such as South Africa, there's some evidence that the adoption of herbicide-tolerant crops and insect-resistant crops saved farm labor, and that farm labor came from the family, and the family could use that labor for other activities, either paid employment or education. And finally, there are environmental gains through better chemical use and lower tillage. So if I want to leave you with one message, agricultural production and food security is both challenged by and part of the solution set for climate change. Africa is ground zero for that challenge. It has the most at risk, but also potentially some of the greatest opportunities because it's lagging some of the technology that already exists now. Agriculture can be a critical part of managing our greenhouse gas as well as responding to the risks that are related to that. And technology is going to be a core part of that. We do have pathways to impact, but for every pathway, there's a hurdle. It's not a barrier. There's just something we have to figure out how to launch over. Some of the hurdles we can lower, some of them we might be able to remove, but there always are going to be hurdles, irrespective of regulatory regimes and others. And at the end of the day, there are vital and valuable opportunities here for all actors in the global agri-food system to do well for themselves by doing good, by actually making technologies that are available and useful for farmers and farm families and the food systems around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. That was a great way to start off our conversation today. Really appreciate that keynote. We are now going to move into the portion of our day where we're going to be having a couple of panels, and I wanted to explain a little bit about how that's going to work. If you're joining us online, there will be a chat function. You can use that chat function to insert any questions or comments that you have to add that to our conversation. Our moderators will be here on the stage, and they will have iPads in their hands so they can look and keep up with the conversation that you're having there online. For those of you that are here in the room, please raise your hand if you have a question that you would like to add during the Q&A part of our panel, and there will be someone in the room that will be roving with a microphone, and we'll hand that over to you so that you can add your question to our panel. All right. So our first panel is going to be promoting food security through climate resilient crops, and that's going to be moderated by Mr. Tinashe Kapuya. Tinashe is a senior program officer for the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa, whereas he is supporting governments to reform agricultural policies to invest in a more conducive environment for trade and investment. Before joining AGRA, Tinashe was a value chain lead for the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, BFAP. He also previously served as the trade and investment head at AgBiz. While we are setting up for the first panel, please enjoy this short crop life video overviewing the role of plant biotech and food security. And we'll invite the panel members to come on up to the stage. Thank you.
Mzansi. This is our pantry. Sometimes it is bursting at the seams with goodness, but other times the cupboards are bare.
I wanted to be a farmer because I had a desire and a passion in terms of food production. That was the first thing. The second thing was also making a meaningful contribution to food security as a commercial farmer in my own right, and also ensure that around me, through the farming operation I envisaged to have, was to make a meaningful contribution to those who are trying to farm and developing in their own right with regards to production. So those are the reasons that drove my farming passion. Rural communities are being hit hard by climate change because they are in a position of not having crop insurance, for example. You're in a position where contouring or water harvesting methods aren't being made available or have deteriorated, which is infrastructure that needs to be improved. One infestation could wipe out, an entire crop, and farmers can never bounce back from that, or it becomes an extremely difficult thing for those farmers in particular. All these challenges that farmers face have also impacted my operation as well. And some of the steps that I've taken are to farm more precise in terms of precision agriculture, crop rotation, and cover crops, which are ways that can improve heavy impact towards climate change. With Eastern Cape, you've got a province that's got over 300,000 hectares of arable land, lying underdeveloped. With aspects such as increased technology investment in those areas, you've got a province that can really turn around the production level with regards to food production in South Africa or for the agricultural industry as a whole.
Our farmers bear the heavy burden of ensuring food security for all of us. But our farmers do not only produce food, they are responsible for producing safe, nutritious food and doing so sustainably. New breeding technologies like genome editing can help farmers achieve this.
One of the leading technologies out there is plant breeding, and that will increase food production, it will mitigate exposure to climate change, and it will be a sustainable way to ensure sound food production at national and or developing level. And one of the benefits of plant breeding is that at a community level, you position the farmers to producing quality food, safe food, and nutritious food, therefore mitigating the big problem of poverty at household level. And that's what plant breeding can do for you as a technology to mitigate climate change. I'm farming currently in Ugie, Eastern Cape. I'm a commercial grain farmer, maize, soybean, sorghum and wheat. And part of my farming strategy has always been to absorb and appreciate technology. And part of those technologies that I've brought on the farm is that I've got a lot of precision agriculture. So my technological aspect in terms of tractor usage is very, very precise. I've also ensured that I do a lot of crop rotation and I use top quality genetics with regards to the type of seed and the fertilizer that I'm exposed to. So adopting these technologies have obviously helped me overcome challenges that affect a lot of farmers. So for example, in terms of making sure that I work within the sustainable environment of my farm, I'm in a position now where I'm less exposed to insect infestation on the farm, which is ways that have improved through the technologies that I've absorbed at Rocky Park Farm. I've seen what poverty does at household level. I grew up in a rural area and it's an impact that a lot of farmers and households cannot sustain. So my work through the rural development work that I do is to change the household food security level. It's to ensure that at least we are impacting or denting the poverty level, but also a situation of production at household level. We need to be in a position where we're taking the household farmers, but also the potential commercial farmers in communal areas to the next level. As farmers, we're producing a food secure South Africa all the time. It's a lot of hard work, and as consumers, it's important that we embrace that and we support that and we continue understanding that farmers are the breadbasket and the foundation of our daily lives as people of this country.
Because we all care about our communities, we support the production of safe, affordable, nutritious food, using sustainable methods to protect the environment. For more information, visit croplife.co.za. CropLife, supporting responsible food production for a better future.
Ladies and gentlemen, those in the audience as well as those online, welcome back to our session. We are going to continue this scintillating discussion, and we will delve a little bit deeper into a more critical topic that is, let's say, urgent topic that is affecting our continent and South Africa as well. We're going to be talking about how to promote food security through climate resilient crops. And maybe to preface that discussion, we are going to be discussing two of the 6 biggest mega trends that are reshaping our global markets, which is climate change and biotech. So to put this into perspective, South Africa currently has 58.7 million people, and the population is set to grow by 24%. So when we reach 72.8 million people over the next 30 years, how are we going to feed those people within the context of obviously limited land resources, where mining and real estate and other competing land uses are continuously reducing our land, our most productive land. To kick off that discussion, I would like to introduce the panel. We have to my right, Coronelo. Corone was born and bred in Bloemfontein in the Free State. And after completing his honors degree in agriculture and economics at the University of the Free State in 2004, he started his working career at Grain SA. And Grain SA is a producer organization representing grain and oilseeds producers in South Africa. And Kone leads the applied economics division. And then he is servicing the team there at Grain SA. So Kone is going to deliver a presentation called The Value of Biotech for Grain and Oilseeds Producers in South Africa. Joining us online. Okay.
Should I go? Great. Dinesh, thank you so much for that introduction. Just a bit more about Grain SA. Grain SA is a producer organization that represents farmers in South Africa, grain and oilseed farmers to be precise. We have more or less 4,500 farmers, that's commercial, and more or less between 8,000 and 12,000 farmers, that's developing farmers, or as we call it, household farmers. So that's just some stats on who we represent. So I think I would like to set the scene maybe for the panel discussion just with a few slides I want to show you. When Prof. Peter spoke about the rainfall in Canada, he mentioned about inches they receive. We talk about millimeters rain we receive. So I think in South Africa, the South African average is less than 500 millimeters. In the grain areas, it might be more, but that's kind of the figures and the moisture we work with. And I think that's exactly the slide I want to start with. And that's why I want to set the scene on the value of biotech crops for the South African farmer. So in South Africa, we actually farm with moisture. If you can't farm with moisture, you can't produce any grain crops, as 90% of our grain and oilseed production is on dry land conditions, while only 10% is on irrigated area. So hence the quote I've put in there: if you want to farm in South Africa, referring to grain and oilseeds, you have to be able to farm with moisture and conserve moisture. I think just to maybe depict why technology is so important and why the South African farmer needs to stay on the edge and the forefront of technology. And you also would see of all the GMO stats that the South African farmer is probably one of the fastest adopters of technology and also GMO technology in the world. And this index that I've shown here is exactly why. We as South African farmers receive very little or even no support from government. We are in a full scheme free market. So there you would see the bottom line below, the blue line, is an index of the maize price, and all the other lines is indexes of different inputs. The purple line, for instance, is our fuel price, our diesel price index. The grey one is the seed prices. Fertilizer, which this year looks very different, is the orange line, and the yellow line is our machinery index. So what this graph shows you, if we're not over time more efficient, we won't be farming anymore in South Africa. So that's why the South African farmer needs to stay on the forefront of technology, better efficiencies, stay on this treadmill that's ever turning faster and faster every year. So just to maybe show you what happened to maize production over time in South Africa, this is a long time ago, but this just show you from the 1920s to the early 1960s, there was a rather slow growth increase from 0.6 tons per hectare to 1.2 ton per hectare at that period, an increase of 3% per year. And then we got to from the early 60s to the 70s, we started to use tractors, started to do deep plowing, which some people would say was the total wrong thing to do, but we started to use more nutrition, and then we started to increase our yields from 1.2 tons per hectare to 1.7 tons, and that was an increase of almost 4% per year. Then suddenly, some people call this the green revolution. We did some soil analysis, fertilizer, especially higher nitrogen usage, and we increased from a 1.7 ton per hectare to a 2.6 tons per hectare, and that increase was almost 5.4% annually. Well, then we hit what we call South Africa, and that's what we know as dry spells. We know that we have dry cycles in South Africa, but that's why we need this technology, why we need new breeding techniques to be able to help us with our risk in South Africa, and that's why we have conferences like this. But then we got to a great increase scenario, a dramatic change, higher potential soils. We had lots of the marginal soils being cut out of grain and oilseed production. Irrigation started to happen, and what I put in blue there is we got new genetics. Hybrids started to come in, and as you said, at the late 1990s, we got Biotech as well, and that's why we've seen that increase. So we moved from a 2.5 tons per hectare average to a 4.3 tons per hectare, and that was a 3.7% increase. So yeah, then we got to precision agriculture, and also every year we got improvement in technology, new hybrids coming in. We actually find out that crop rotation actually benefits maize production as well. So we started to rotate with especially soybeans, and then that increased our yields for maize significantly. So that was just to cover maybe some of the highlights where we were in the history in South Africa's maize production and technology. But I think I just wanted to show you this nice graph that depicts countries that make use of this is a yellow maize example where South Africa exports to. There you would see Taiwan is our biggest customer over a 5-year average, then Vietnam, Japan, but you will see the rest is Southern African countries that really make use of South African yellow maize. When we get to our staple, which is white maize, you will see lots of the countries in the top 10 is our neighboring countries, also lots of Eastern African countries making use of our white maize production in South Africa. So this is my last slide, just to maybe illustrate and talk on the South African farmers that's really fast adapters to technology. I already explained why. If we're not staying on that treadmill, we won't have South African grain and oilseed farmers anymore. Because of our low rainfall, we really need that technology to help our farmers. As I said, at the late 90s, we adopted GMO technology in South Africa for maize, soybean, and wheat. I also know the cotton farmers make use of technology as well. For maize, we currently have insect-resistant and herbicide-resistant traits. We've got at soybeans currently herbicide tolerant. In the near space, in the coming season, we expect also insect resistance for soybeans, and in the near future we expect drought tolerant wheat and soybeans as well, which our farmers are really looking forward to. So thank you, Tanesh. That was my scene setter for the panel discussion later on.
Kone, that was fantastic. Thanks very much. I think this presents quite a nice segue into the discussion that we're going to have for the rest of the session. If I could introduce our virtual participant, Jack Okamuro. Jack is joining us online. Thank you very much, Jack, for being part of the panel. Jack is actually a national program leader for crop. Sorry, it's the USDA's chief in-house research agency. I'm sorry, English is a second language for me. Still trying to get all the words right. His responsibilities include crop genomics and genetics, crop biotechnology, and biotechnology risk assessment, and crop bioinformatics and knowledge-based development. That's a lot of, that's a mouthful. I mean, I'm just an economist, so I'm trying to learn some of it. Jack, welcome. You can please bless us with your wisdom today as we forge ahead in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kabuya. It's great to be here. And good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the organizers, Minister Councillor Abdi, CropLife South Africa, and USDA for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you from the USDA Agricultural Research Service, which is the in-house research arm of the Department of Agriculture. So why biotechnology? Why today? If you can go to the next slide. Let's see. I should have practiced this before, right? Let's see if I can shift. Okay, well, we've got it. Somebody else is shifting slides for me. That's great. As we know, U.S. farmers globally are facing unprecedented challenges, increased production costs, extreme weather events, new crop diseases, new invasive pests, water shortages, and more, all of which do not recognize international borders. So as was mentioned previously, demand for innovation in agriculture has never been greater. So what is USDA ARS doing to help meet this epic challenge? How are we investing limited resources to develop more climate resilient crops? And how can we accelerate our rate of progress and thus mitigate or help mitigate global change. So if we go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The convergence of breeding approaches used today at USDA ARS is referred to as breeding 4.0 or biology-based breeding. So key to strengthening crop resilience is using our expanding knowledge of plant and crop adaptation to diverse environments, knowledge of plant gene function, genetics, physiology, molecular biology within and also across plant species. So for example, if we go to the next slide, please. This map on the left reminds me that crop wild relatives are an important source of novel genetic diversity for use in conventional breeding and for use in biotechnology. Reminds me that U.S. crop germplasm can be an informationally rich resource for geneticists and breeders looking for new sources of genes for climate resilience. So in this particular case for maize, ARS scientists and their collaborators revealed that thousands of genes contribute to the success of corn land races and their adaptation to different environments across the Americas. And when combined with genetic molecular mapping experiments carried out at some of these locations, hundreds of adaptive genes were identified and shared with international breeders, both public and industry. So ARS scientists are continuing to add important new knowledge of existing genetic diversity and on crop-plant interactions with the environment at the whole genome and systems level so that we can use this information in a science-based way through conventional breeding and through using biotechnology. So let me switch to another crop now and go to wheat. So if I could have the next slide, please. Yep. Notable examples of using not only genetics, but biotechnology, including genome editing, include resistance to diseases for wheat and related crops, to fusarium head blight, and resistance to wheat stem rust. We are also using genome editing and biotechnology to analyze the genes that are responsible for human sensitivity to gluten proteins, as well as genes that are responsible for human celiac disease, in order to use new breeding technologies to reduce these adverse effects on human consumers. And this is in large part thanks to a major international wheat genome sequencing effort that U.S. wheat breeders are now using genome editing to develop key producer and consumer traits for wheat. So as you know, the rate of climate change is not abating. So how about breeding for resilience to future climate scenarios? So as we know, CO2 and other greenhouse gases are increasing rapidly. Crop damaging ground level ozone concentrations are double what they were in pre-industrial times. The frequency and intensity of heat and drought in the West continues to worsen. So at ARS, our FACE or free air concentration and enrichment facilities at ARS locations across the US allow our scientists and collaborators to analyze how crops and their wild relatives and/or new genetically engineered lines perform in the field under future climate scenarios, including elevated CO2, temperature, ozone, and drought. And engineering teams are focusing on a number of traits, which I've shown here, including enhanced photosynthetic efficiency, photorespiratory bypass, canopy optimization, improving rubisco, times for using, again, knowledge-based, science-based approaches approaches to engineering and re-engineering crop plants so that they're better adapted to the challenges of future climate change scenarios. Okay, so I'd like to shift gears now for just a moment, maybe back to the big picture. So we talked about corn so far and wheat and some other field crops. I didn't mention soybean, but this is a experimental field of soybean shown here. But many crops lack the personnel and financial resources of corn, wheat, soybean, or other research and breeding communities. But nonetheless, they can benefit from sharing germplasm information, data, computational support. So then how is ARS harnessing the power of Breeding 4.0 across the agency today? So if you go to the next slide, this just gives you a sense of the number of crops that and animal systems that USDA ARS is working on in terms of research and breeding. And over a 5-year period, if you look at the graph on the right, we've released 621 new varieties or germplasm lines, and many are perennial crops with long generation times. So how do we accelerate the pace of crop genetic improvement for so many crops? How do we increase the translation of basic and applied research to the field? And how do we ensure that no crop gets left behind? So if we can go to the next slide. So one key program at USDA ARS we call Breeding Insight, which is what was established in 2018 by ARS in partnership with Cornell University. It is a digital ecosystem for ARS breeder support that leverages key investments in research and breeding by the USDA, investments by NSF, USAID, Gates Foundation, and others. And Breeding Insight allows ARS breeders and collaborators to focus on what they do best, which is the breeding, while Breeding Insight scientists and staff focus on genotyping, data management, trait analysis, and germplasm improvement. So at maturity, the Breeding Insight program will support roughly 50 to 60 specialty crops and animal livestock breeding programs. So the goal here again is so that no crop is left behind at ARS, this breeding revolution. Of course, trait integration from crop wild relatives using conventional marker-assisted breeding is labor-intensive, time-consuming, and expensive. Genome editing is increasingly favored by young scientists as an alternative to conventional trait integration and marker-assisted breeding. The climate resilient crop development could be and must be accelerated by increasing resources for biotechnology research is a very strong message which is coming from the next generation of scientists, and I concur. So if I could have that next slide, please. I'd like to close with a simple summary statement on breeding for climate resilient crops. So we are at a historic crossroads in agriculture and human history due to our carbon-based economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that science and technology can help turn the tide quickly and dramatically if used wisely. And so for crops, open access to germplasm diversity, genome sequences, field data, combined with new tools and technologies are key to enabling breeders, both conventional and those using biotechnology across agriculture to breed more climate resilient crops. So I thank you and turn it back to our moderator.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks so much for that presentation. I just wrote online for our online audience to please post any questions that you might have on the chat. I'll pick them up and then we can discuss them after we're done with the panelists. So And we will also make sure that we catch every one of those questions as much as we can. The next panelist I would like to introduce is Ben Duron. I hope I didn't butcher your surname. Ben is a Chief Director for Bioinnovation at the National Department of Science and Innovation in South Africa. His responsibilities include the implementation of the South African Bioeconomy Strategy, launched in January 2014. And he oversees innovation in agriculture, health, industry and environment, and indigenous knowledge systems. Ben, the floor is yours. Ben is going to talk to us about agricultural bioinnovation and climate resilience. The floor is yours, Ben.
Thanks very much, Tanashi. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the invitation to participate. As has been introduced, I'm from government. I'm from the Department of Science and Innovation, so I'm giving a government perspective, and I certainly don't want to repeat what has already been so eloquently put forward, so I'm going to try and change the perspective a little bit, but I think the global perspective that Peter provided and the local perspective that Corné provided is absolutely fantastic to set the scene for what government is viewing as the challenge. And I'm going to pick on some quotes that have been given already. Peter pointed out that innovation is needed, and certainly that's the perspective that I'm pushing. But let me just start with the likely impacts of climate change. Sorry, and I'm not talking specifically to my slide. I'll go through those slides quickly. But we've got sea level rises, both from ice melting, which is not a local problem, but obviously it does affect the whole world because the seas connect everywhere, but also because of the expansion of the seawater. So sea level rise. We're going to have extreme weather events. We're already seeing this around the world. Drought and heat is going to increase. There's going to be changes in precipitation. In South Africa, we're not exactly sure whether there's an increase or decrease, but certainly there's going to be changes, and it's likely to be more intense than it has previously been. Longer growing season, you may think that this is wonderful. We can grow more. But obviously, it's going to depend where you are. If the heat is too extreme, you're not going to have a growing season. So there's going to be change there. There's definitely going to be biodiversity changes, and not just in terms of wildlife, but also in terms of pests and diseases that change their demographics across the globe. And then we're going to see changes in human, animal, and plant health, not only because of the pests and diseases, but also because of the changing stresses. And so these are some of the predicted changes that we're likely to see, but I'm of the view that the unanticipated, the unknown changes are going to have at least an equal amount of impact. And because they're unanticipated, we can't predict them, we can't plan for them, which then underscores the critical importance of having a functioning innovation system, not only locally, obviously locally, but globally. We need to be able to change and adapt to climate change in all the different areas as quickly as possible. So we're looking at the mitigation of the impact to crops, but we also want to reduce the carbon outputs, and we want to be ready to be able to react. And one of the key things that I'd like to push as well, although climate change is generally a very negative thing, but it has already been mentioned by Peter, that there is huge opportunity in climate change. And we need to be able to not only defend ourselves and mitigate and be cautious with, we need to be able to grab the opportunity and take things forward. And just one example is carbon capture from our coal-fired power stations. If we could do that, we would have a fantastic resource. I'm not saying we're there yet at all, but we would have a fantastic carbon resource that we could use for a whole range of biomass type materials. So let me get on with my presentation, and really I'm not going to go through the detail. Am I pointing this the right way? There we go. So our major investment in the agricultural space is the Agricultural Bioinnovation Partnership Program. This was approved by our DG, Director General of the Department of Science and Innovation in 2017. We're looking at increased productivity, food security and sustainable rural development, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a partnership program. Again, Peter, you did say this. We can't do this alone, either from government or from business. We have to do this in partnership. We don't even necessarily fund the early stage stuff. We do this in partnership with industry. Corné is our partner in Grain SA in driving this forward, and we value the hands-on and real-world capability that Grain SA has to complement our more head-in-the-clouds type academic thinking from government as to what we need to do. It's managed by the Technology Innovation Agency, and we have a steering committee that oversees the development. I'm really not going to go into this, except perhaps to mention that the agricultural challenges in South Africa are massive. We're not only dealing with potential climate change issues, we're dealing with trying to get small-scale farmers becoming viable, economically active, economically viable people on the South African scene, which is a substantial challenge. We're not talking just about the large-scale farmers. We're looking at creating livelihoods for small-scale farmers. And everyone knows that on a small scale, your overheads are so much higher. So major challenges there. These are some of the successes that we've done, that we've had over the last while. We've got so many small-scale farms that have been assisted. We've been improving nutrition. We've been supporting research, knowledge products, students and jobs. And there's a whole range of programs within the DS, not just in my section, that are also contributing to the bioeconomy strategy. Under the Agricultural Bioinnovation Partnership Program, we have a climate resilience consortium. Again, we can think what is the priority in government, but we actually really need the partnership with industry to be able to say these are the real world problems, and it's going to have a real impact. So we are co-funding with Grain SA in this example, and the objectives is to build a knowledge base on the effect of climate change on agriculture. Obviously, these are the knowable things, and develop climate change response plans. In the building the knowledge base, we have a series of projects that we are looking at developing. I'm not going to go through these in detail. In the second thing, developing climate change response plans, we also have a number of projects that are looking at how do we adapt to the climate change that is coming, that is already here. And we also have a breeding program that is looking at drought tolerance and heat stress for maize, and that is well underway as well. The point that I want to make is it's not enough that we do things in adapting to climate change because of all the unknowable impacts that climate change is going to have. So what we have to do in South Africa, but this is global, is modernize our agriculture. We have to deal with the challenges that the agricultural sector faces, and our particular interest is in the small-scale farmers, but we're looking at digital platforms, we're looking at biosecurity, we're looking at phenomics, enabling our farmers, particularly the small-scale farmers, but not only the small-scale farmers, to be able to be more productive and have knowledge at their fingertips that is useful, that enables them to participate economically and more viably. So some general points. We have a variety of unique challenges to our agricultural sector, particularly the small scale, extension, skills, urbanization. People are often moving. There's been a large scale movement to urban centers in South Africa. Finance remains a challenge. We've got a lot of financing options, microfinancing, but it's always is a problem. And there is also the challenge of government dependence, that there's an expectation that government will provide, and we need to find ways of ensuring economic viability without creating this dependence on government. We need to be able to expand to higher value crops and niche opportunities because of our small scale farmers. If they are competing with large scale farmers with maize, we are really fighting an uphill battle. So we need to look at greater opportunities, greater value that we can derive from the land. Although our investment is small, as I said, this is a partnership program and it's having a real impact because of the real world knowledge that industry brings. And it is also critical that the industry's awareness of the potential impacts of climate change is considered. I just want to emphasize climate change is not just a crop adaptation problem, it's a massive social and environmental challenge. We're looking at flooding, we're looking at disease, drought, human and animal behavior and relocations, changing endemisms of various organisms. So agriculture is critical, but the modern agricultural ability to adapt and change and improve efficiencies, as Corné has pointed out, is so critical in South Africa, is absolutely vital. So we can't keep doing things the same old way and hope things will muddle through. We have to move forward. So this is the approach that the South African government is taking with a very small portion of money, but we've made it substantially larger because of the partnership approach. Thanks very much.
Ben, thanks very much for that. I was going to ask you the question, but I'll wait for, because this partnership approach is really important, I think, when we are going to tackle this enormous challenge. So maybe we can start thinking about, some, what kind of partnerships the Grain SA and government alliance is achieving and how it's also helping the smallholder farmers. While we are mulling on that, I'm aware that we're running behind time. I think we're 10 minutes behind. I want to invite our last panelist, Roxleen van der Meer. I hope I got the pronunciation right. Roxleen is a senior plant science lecturer at the University of the Free State, where she lectures undergraduate in the field of plant breeding and supervises a number of postgraduate students conducting various research projects. I know that your specialty is soybean breeding for various traits improvement. I've worked on some soybean work in the past, and I think South Africa has demonstrated quite an enormous success in that, at least from a production perspective. You can give us the back end of that story of how legumes are fighting against climate change. Roxleen, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm really privileged to be standing here amongst all these distinguished individuals. I hope I will make up some time. All right, so we know that climate is changing, and that is a fact. And the impact it has on agriculture and food production is a reality. Now, apart from climate change, agriculture is also faced with other challenges. This is population growth, malnutrition, increasing demand of agricultural inputs, and then also the increased prices of fertilizers we've seen recently. So being a soybean breeder and researcher, I believe that legume crops are the little marvels that can tackle these changes or challenges. So it is the second most agriculturally economically important crop family after cereals, play a crucial role in human nutrition and sustainable agriculture because of the healthy food option it is, providing high and complete protein, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, fix atmospheric nitrogen, reduce the need for fertilizers, and then also improve soil quality. So in the face of climate change, breeding climate resilient varieties, impulses or legumes in general, should focus on genetic improvement for adaptive traits. So climate resilient crops are those crops that have enhanced tolerance to biotic and abiotic stresses. And apart from the management productions and the technologies that farmers should use or change on the farms to cope with climate change, planting or growing crop varieties that is climate resilient is also one of the ways to mitigate climate change. So they're intended to maintain or increase crop yields under abiotic stress conditions. So these are crops that have adaptive traits which help them to survive, reproduce, and recover under specific abiotic stress conditions. So using genome sequencing and genomic-assisted selection, a number of adaptive traits for various legumes have been identified for specific abiotic stress conditions. And the existing genetic diversity in the pulses provides opportunities to exploit novel attributes for developing climate-resilient varieties. So for our soybean breeding program, we are focusing on pre-breeding for heat and drought stress amongst other yield and nutritional components. So the prime criteria for a breeding program is the germplasm. And this is where you need genetic diversity to select for in the breeding program. So we do screening for resistant germplasm using our soybean collection of a number of varieties. Then we also need a target environment. This is now a field experiment or glasshouse experiment where we evaluate the plant's responses to heat and drought stress. Then you need also suitable screening techniques. This is to identify the traits that are responsive to drought and heat stress, and that can also be used as selection criteria in the breeding program. So our field trials are conducted then on a farm in the Free State. Now the Free State is known for its very dry and warm environment. And this is where we apply deficit irrigation to impose drought stress. Then we use yield under stress and non-stress conditions, and then we separate the genotypes into tolerant and susceptible groups based on tolerance indices. So the yields are used in calculations to determine the tolerance indices. Then the genotypes are selected from each group, and these genotypes are then planted in the greenhouse, where we look at the specific responses to its adaptive traits amongst these varieties. So the traits associated with drought tolerance responses and that shows positive correlations with yield components are then identified. And also from results that we get here, parents for the breeding program are also identified and crossed. And this is followed by a conventional breeding or selection program, which is the pedigree selection based on the adaptive traits. So we look at a number of traits within our research group. So what is the role of the biotechnology then in the breeding? So currently we don't apply any biotechnology in our breeding program. We realize that in order to develop a soybean variety, it will take you 10 to 14 years until that variety is released. So we realize that we need to speed up and accelerate the breeding program. So therefore the need for speed breeding and then also use of DNA marker-assisted selection techniques and genome-wide association maps. So we are currently using DNA markers in marker-assisted selection within the breeding program, mainly for pod shattering resistance and sclerotinia disease. But we are not using any genes specifically for selection for drought responses. So advances in genomics resulted in the identification of candidate genes controlling various morphological and adaptive traits across the pulses. But we've realized that the soybean is lagging behind. And we need to incorporate, as a breeder, multiple adaptive traits into the background of the popular varieties. So we identify varieties that are very popular, and then we want to transfer these traits that will contribute to the wide regulatory pathway for drought and heat stress tolerance. So the newer approaches, transgenics, genome editing, and epigenetics, still need to be exploited in legumes, especially for the soybean. So thank you, and on behalf of our group at the University of the Free State, all working together in this drought and heat stress tolerance, we would like to thank you for this opportunity.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thanks, Roxanne, for that presentation. I think that's a nice case study for soybean that we can reflect on a little bit during the discussion. I am still checking online if there are any questions, apart from the one that is asking about the availability of the presentation, which it will be after the session. So I would fire my own question. I will be also looking for hands in the audience. If there are any burning questions that need to be asked to our panelists. But to kick off, I think my first question would be referring to maybe Corne and Ben around the public-private partnership. One of the challenges that South Africa, not just South Africa, is facing, but also the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, is around how to make smallholder farmers adopt biotech and do it at scale, because that's probably where the biggest challenge is. I think, Corne, you had already indicated that historically, commercial farmers have been very fast adopters, but maybe the pace of adoption amongst our smallholder farmers is probably not going to be as quick for various reasons. But what kind of effort have you, as a case example, have you done with the government and trying to get this partnership going and getting our smallholder farmers to also adopt biotech? Maybe you can start, Corne.
Dinesh, thank you so much. I think by way of example, I can indicate how important new technology is for small-scale farmers as well. We've got a farmer development program, and in some cases where they used to plant for their own usage, they would get 1 ton per hectare, for example, on dryland conditions. Bringing in our program, using the latest technology, crop protection, chemicals, just the right practices of soil conservation, we've increased that 1 ton per hectare to a commercial yield. So some of the technologies are not scale-based. So a small-scale farmer can also use these technologies to even better his livelihood. So suddenly that household don't only get 1 ton per hectare, but a 6 to 7 ton per hectare. And now suddenly you don't only sustain yourself, but you can do something else with that crop. And just by using the right seed, the right technology, and the right practices.
Perfect. Ben, while in terms of funding, there's a wider belief out there that government is not putting enough money behind R&D. What is your experience with government's commitment and intent and resource allocation around this challenge?
Thank you. Do I have to answer in public? The fact is, government is committed to a much greater proportion of R&D spend in South Africa. It's just been unable to deliver that. And because of the recent COVID epidemic, we've actually gone backwards, which is really unfortunate. But nevertheless, there is a commitment to increasing the R&D spend. But as Corne put it, the subsidy to the agricultural sector is minimal to non-existent at best. And this is a major challenge. And there were good reasons, I believe, or good intentions when the democratic dispensation came to South Africa for actually changing the way that we do business. But we need to seriously reassess the situation that we're in and reevaluate the importance of certain subsidies that will help it. But nevertheless, agriculture is a critical part of our economy. Fortunately, it's not the biggest part, as it is in many other African countries, but it is a critical part, and as we move forward into the sustainable bioeconomy future, not only of South Africa, but the globe, we need to make sure that the primary production of biological resources can develop and maintain, because you can use them for so many other things. And thus, it is critical that government at some stage starts to be more serious about its investment in the agricultural sector amongst other bioeconomy sectors.
Great stuff. So there's a question online from Dave Berger. It's directed to Prof. Peter Phillips. How much more cost effective is gene editing compared to GM for a field crop? Do I need to repeat it?
Yeah, no,
you got it.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole variety of estimates out there. It's the current estimate is that what a GM research system would take a couple of years to do can be collapsed into weeks or months. And so the front end of the research space has the potential to be really telescoped into a small, very targeted effort. Now, the big question for everybody who's looking at gene editing as a tool is, can they similarly reduce the regulatory oversight? And that's the $64 question. The United States has made a decision that they, for the most part, will be exempt from the extensive process that GM crops would have. Europe is at the moment leaning to require they follow the full GM process, which is large and growing, and every other country is muddling through. Some have aligned for market purposes with the US model, others have aligned with the European model, but many countries have no policy at all yet, and they're waiting for the technology to present itself. And so what we're finding in the breeding space that I deal with, which is very similar to what was described in South Africa, is that there are breeders throughout the Canadian breeding space in the public sector applying gene editing tools to the crops they're interested in, but so far nobody is willing to consider taking them to market, because until they know the question about how it will be interrogated, they will do a proof of concept through gene editing, and then they'll work back, in most cases, through conventional breeding techniques to produce a commercial cultivar. So they're trying to avoid that, and that's the challenge they face. Maybe I can add just one quick follow-up to this question of partnerships, because I did sort of raise it. I think both respondents have made really good points. Let me add two little bits. On the public producer private partnership side about adoption, there's a whole myriad of ways that different countries and different farm groups have tried to accelerate tech adoption. We've seen some of these organizations of producers similar to Grain SA get together and run co-op trials, just to head-to-head trials to show the producers the efficacy of the technology. And that sometimes involves field days where people get out and walk around through them, sometimes small trialing. Monsanto early on in the GM area had just enough seed to produce a small crop in 1995. Instead of giving it to 5 producers, they gave it to 5,000 producers. Everybody got a little bit so they could trial it, because doing it yourself is the best way of producing technology. And so there's a whole variety of tools that the farm level have been doing. The other part is that the farm level actually funds in some of these countries research is similar to the work that's been described here. But in a lot of cases, they do it internationally. They don't do everything by themselves. The one group that I've been very impressed with that's very rapacious in building partnerships that bring knowledge back to them are the Australians. They've been very effective at pushing their way into the lentil breeding world, which is about 80 or 90 active groups around the world, and position themselves in ways that they bring the technology and the knowledge back to Australia at low or no cost, just by being part of the system. So there's instead of doing it yourself, you belong to the team. And so there are networks of breeding communities that sometimes are accessible quite often not by banging on the door of the multinational, but banging on the door of the public or university breeder who's working in the space, who's a bit more open and willing to engage. So partnerships have a lot of potential to leverage the knowledge part, which is the really expensive part of the breeding system, and to accelerate the breeding programs themselves.
Yeah. I'm going to, Jack, I hope you're still online. I hope you haven't left it. Oh, yeah, there you go. There you go.
Yes, I'm here.
Jack, I mean, you are working, I believe, at the cutting edge of research. And when you're looking at Africa and its challenges, as described by colleagues here, do you have any insight into what you think might need to be done to advance biotech and its adoption in the continent, not just in South Africa, but maybe broadly in Africa, from your experience?
Well, maybe not. First of all, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. Maybe not in the major field crops because they're regional, and I'm not part of that system. But Chris Stardick is coming up in the next session, and he's a USDA ARS scientist. He works in tree fruit crops, and so very different situation in crops with long generation times, perennial tree fruit, nuts, and so on. It takes a long time if you're going to integrate a trait from a wild crop relative into a modern breeding program. And so in terms of an emerging pest or disease, it may be very desirable for producers to have that pest or disease resistant more quickly through the use of genome editing or biotechnology, as opposed to folks that are breeding annual crops. So, and a good example is citrus greening or Honglong-Bing disease. So, unfortunately, we did not have a biotech solution for citrus greening that was ready to plug in and play. And so if you're able to catch a disease early with a technology, I think you can have great social impact, great economic impact. And whereas if it takes time to develop that technology, that trait, to go through regulations, it can be very devastating. And, again, I come back to COVID-19 pandemic. Think where we would be if we didn't have the RNA technologies, if we didn't have biotechnology that enabled us to rapidly develop the vaccines for this devastating disease. I think many of us wouldn't be here today if it were not for biotechnology. So I think we have to be prepared. We have to foster a culture which supports the development of innovation and new technologies, and be ready when the opportunity arises. So back to you, Mr. Kapuya.
Thanks, Jack. There is a question from our audience. How many questions do we? I see one hand, second hand. Yeah, we can have in that order. Thank you.
Was I first?
Yes.
Thanks. Obviously, the focus of your discussion here is climate resilient crops. Now, I would argue, looking at the data that you presented here today, that is it there? Working? 1, 2, 3. The light is still on. Okay, quickly starting again. You're focusing on climate resilient crops. And I think the data already shows that some of the technologies and the innovations that we see in the field can contribute to what we're looking for. But these are only the crops. We need also kind of innovation resilient systems to implement these crops. And what I refer to here is a wide range of things that, Peter, you referred to some of them. But it's the farming systems, for example, it's the innovation, it's the governance systems, it's things like IP management and seed regulation in countries, all those type of things. Can I ask that the different presenters, because there's a researcher, there's somebody in the field, the governance aspects and then the policy aspects, maybe just say, what do you think are the biggest obstacles in terms of these other systems, which will allow us to actually introduce these and not only then identify them, but please give us an idea of how we're going to resolve these then, please. Focusing maybe on, if we look at those gaps, Peter, again, you showed a thing there that showed different places in the world, there's acceptance or not. So why and how are we going to get over this?
Yeah. Great question. I think Ben did mention of a functioning innovation system that can adapt to the challenge. I think that's almost related, if I'm assuming, if I captured that question well. We can start with any of them, right?
Maybe I can have a step first, Dinesh, if that's okay. I think to answer the question, I have to go back a bit into history. Our maize crop, for example, in South Africa was bred on conventional breeding. And I think if you compare our germplasm to other countries, we probably have the most adapted germplasm to drought in the world. When companies brought their maize drought-resistant genes to South Africa, it didn't have a massive effect because of the great breeding we've done over 30 years odd time. So I think with conventional breeding, we've done great up until now. So what's next? As I said, we need to stay on top of that sharp edge of technology. What's going to help us to stay on that treadmill? Is it going to be conventional breeding? I doubt it. There's easier, better, more efficient ways these days. The new breeding techniques or technology that everyone's talking about, it's not even compared to maybe GMOs or non-GMOs. It's the broad concept of breeding techniques, looking at gene editing and examples like that. So I don't know if I've answered your question from a farmer perspective. That's where we see the new growth and the new defense on resilient crops to be.
I would really like to hear from Roxleen, because you work, you probably might be one of the most frustrated amongst us, because you do some of this stuff on the ground and you can see how it moves from the field all the way into the user's hands, right? The farmers. What do you think is the challenge that the delivery model and the system in getting some of that, the research and the techniques that you're doing all the way, seeing it all the way to play out to the consumers?
Right. So being a researcher at the university is different from a breeder at a commercial seed company, I would say. So I think my experience will be a little bit different from a commercial or the breeding companies that breed varieties for commercial farmers. From what I know from being married to a farmer as well, that the adoption of farmers the adoption of new varieties by farmers is really a challenge. So they learn from experience. So not just paging through the grain SA and see this new research and the new varieties. I've seen by word of mouth. seeing what's happening on other farms, talking to other farmers of what's happening in the field, what are they growing, and I mean in a specific region. I'm coming from southwestern Free State, so the varieties that we grow there is totally different from the varieties that they grow in the eastern Free State in the same province. So farmers, I see, they learn from other farmers, and the newer generation of farmers, they are really willing to test new varieties, not on a large scale. They would start with these smaller trials, and they would test them and compare them. But now we also have climate variability, so from year to year, we also see differences in yields with the same varieties. But then there's also a quick turnaround for some of the maize hybrids I've seen within the seed companies as well. So now you decide on a specific hybrid, it's doing well, I see very good yields. And the next year that hybrid is not on the market anymore. So then they grow new things. So I think the turnaround of hybrids is helping for farmers to adopt new varieties going into the market. And I think from the university, from a research university side, conventional breeding will also have its place. It's not like a climate resilient variety is totally different from a conventionally bred one. What we do is just to incorporate genes for traits that give them better adaptation. So what I've seen from my research is that a variety that has a very good yield under a certain abiotic stress condition can have a yield reduction of, say, 50 or 80%. And this is what we try to reduce by incorporating adaptive traits into those varieties to reduce on the yield reduction and say, but what traits can we incorporate for genes expressions under these conditions that can bring down that yield gap from 50% say to 20%. So, so for us as researchers, I think it's a bit different. So for me, conventional breeding will always have its place because this is where adaptation, like Kunai was saying, the hybrids that came over all these years were developed in South Africa under within specific regions where we already experienced some abiotic stress conditions over the years. So conventional breeding will have its place, but I think to accelerate it, yes, we need biotechnology or marker-assisted techniques, advanced techniques to accelerate the release of those varieties.
Wonderful. I know.
Can I add a point to that? Because I think the question was really important, and Peter did say it in his talk. Innovation is not only about science-based technologies, it's about changing the way that we do business, and it's engaging with farmers to do things differently. So it's not necessarily here's a new technology that we can plant here and everything will be solved. It's actually improving the way. Now, South Africa was an early adopter of GM technologies, but for some reason we're a late adopter for gene editing technologies. And I honestly don't have good reasons for it, but it's, in my view, because we are not being innovative enough and we're not thinking about where the world is going. So I'm still optimistic that we will catch up and start doing things, but it's absolutely critical that we are innovative in all different spheres.
Let me add just a small item, and that is that as you think about adaptation and adoption and the role of the farmer, trialing and talking to each other is critical, but what we're finding in many parts of the world is that there's a training gap, that as you bring in more sophisticated machinery, as you bring in new genetics, as you bring in new algorithms for balancing inputs and outputs, all of those require some extra training. In some parts of the world, they outsource that. So many of the large enterprises in North America have agronomists who are like your consulting doctor who come in and give you a prognosis and give you a plan. You might not use it, you might not do the exercises the way they want, but you at least know what the experts think. But skills training is one of the critical ones, and as we move into gene editing in the research world, and as we move into more mechanical sensing in the farm world, we're finding that in many cases the people just don't know how to take up and use the technology optimally. And so it's not university degrees, it's often
Applied stuff.
applied training that will be critical to being able to really trial
Yeah.
and take up some of these technologies.
Great point. I'm also keeping in mind that we are a little bit over time, but there was a question that we probably just need to quickly capture before we conclude our session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It was mentioned that Africa is ground zero for this type of technology in order to ensure food security. The wonderful technology that's coming online, but I'm not hearing anything about how we're actually going to get this technology in the ground in a continent that has traditionally been against this kind of technology.
Yeah.
How are we going to change mindsets of whole communities and whole countries so that they start adapting this kind of life-saving technology?
Great point. We have all governments that don't want to really engage on this topic. Peter, do you have a response?
Let me make an observation about what worked well in Europe and the United States and Canada as new technologies emerged. There was a perception that somebody important should trot out and explain and promote the technology, either a CEO or a politician or somebody who has a position in this space. What they found, in fact, was that the most effective communicator of the opportunities and the importance of these technologies for the long-term future of farming were farmers themselves. That farmers became their own advocates, not the CEO of the farm cooperatives, but the people who could walk around and explain to people in familiarization tours, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Because one of the biggest things that we discovered when we plunked biotech in the middle of modern agriculture in North America and Europe was nobody knew how people farmed already. So they were thinking it was an extensive pastoral industry. And all of a sudden you've got this high-tech genetic system. And so all the changes for 100 years got plunked on biotech to explain. So it's important that industry explain what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what benefit it brings to the consumer and to the community in which the farmer lives. That's a very effective communication strategy, and where it's been used, it has, particularly proactively, it has created a willingness and a tolerance and sometimes an enthusiasm for new technology. But where people just say, trust me, and don't disclose, that's when people get nervous and start second guessing the choices that others are making.
So transparency.
Transparency, but transparency by the actual person who's benefiting from it, not the agents, not the experts, not the hired spokespersons.
Yeah. I know that, Ben, you have a burning point.
Can I add to the discussion?
Yeah.
I think Peter is absolutely right, but I think there's more to it. The GM debate in Africa was highly politicized because we had American advocacy for the technology, we had European reticence, and Africa didn't have the practical on-the-ground technology skills or adoption, and it was looking at these tensions. And I think it's absolutely critical that with the gene editing technology, this is not lumped in with GM technologies. In other words, this is a new step forward. We need to treat it differently. The transparency and the social acceptance and so on is so much more important.
Got it. Yeah, that's very important. There are recent developments, I think, in Europe and in China that seem to signal that Africa, the rest of the continent, is now the only region that is reluctant to do anything on this particular topic with regulations and stuff. We are running out of, I think we've overused all of our time. And I would have loved to have Jack have the last say. Jack, are you still online? You can have one last parting shot and then we can conclude the session.
Okay, so technologies are are critical, that we live in an age of technology and innovation. That is not going to change. The climate is going to continue to change. So we have to continue to move forward scientifically, work with the agricultural community to bring these innovations forward, and have outreach to the growers. So as was said, farmers need to see plots of gene-edited crops in the field. They need to talk to the people that are growing them and why they are better in some ways than maybe what they are currently growing. So it's about communication, it's about being transparent, and I applaud you for this panel and for an excellent group of speakers. So thank you, Mr. Kapuya.
Great. Thank you so much, Jack. I want to thank my panelists for a very scintillating discussion. I think it was well done. You guys gave us some very good information and some very good points. I just hope that we can advance this conversation beyond this platform as well, and also beyond the South Africa, to the rest of the continent as well, where I think this technology is quite needed urgently. Thank you very much, colleagues. And to those that are online, thank you very much. We can continue to dialogue on the comment section. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I grew up in a community that is very poverty-stricken. There are many households that struggle to make a living. So they saw farming as an opportunity to make a living for their own families. And also it is something that has been passed down from generations to generation in my community. I am studying agriculture because I want to pass all the knowledge that I've learned to the young members of my community so that they can also learn how to make their own money, start their own businesses.
Farming is not just a job, it's a way of life. Farmers are not just producing crops, they are ensuring food security and enriching lives.
My grandmother is the one who exposed me to the world of farming. So we used to plant vegetables in the backyard, in our garden. Apart from eating the vegetables ourselves, some of the vegetables were sold at the market or door to door in our community. In the old days, many households practiced farming. It was a lifestyle. But now we are growing up in a generation where people have moved away from that culture.
The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 2 is to end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. Research and development play an integral role in achieving this goal globally.
I think technology is important in the field of agriculture because it makes things more advanced. It reduces a lot of labor costs and it makes things even safer. It saves time and there are more implements that can be used that work faster than human labor. As much as time is moving, pests and diseases are also evolving. Technology can eliminate all those problems and make farming easier, and everyone can produce better quality crops. Technology such as plant breeding innovation has made it easier for farmers around the world to farm sustainably, producing crops of better quality. Using more technology in farming can help protect the environment and help farmers farm sustainably. One of my biggest dreams is to give back to my community. I would like to go back and start a community farm where everyone in the community can be invited to join. I would like to see young and old people coming together to plant, grow, and also make money for themselves. There is nothing that I would like to see more than young people being involved in agriculture.
Because we all care about ending hunger, we should all work towards supporting the production of safe, affordable, nutritious food in a responsible manner that protects our environment. For more information, visit croplife.co.za. CropLife, supporting responsible food production for a better future.
Welcome back, everyone. For those of you joining us in the room, please take your seats. Our next panel will discuss promotion of environmental stewardship through agricultural biotechnology. and it will be moderated by Henny Grunewald. Henny Grunewald is the Executive Manager of Biosafety South Africa, a national service platform that facilitates sustainable biotech innovation. It is the principal instrument within the National Biotech Innovation System, which enables compliant, sustainable, and effective research, development, innovation, and commercialization. Looking forward to this panel. Over to you, Henny.
Thank you so much. Welcome everybody online and people in present here. I'm looking very much forward to this session. It's a very exciting topic. I'm going to be very complimentary about this session because I didn't think of it myself, but I love this title of promoting the environmental stewardship. So what it tells me is this is not a reactive discussion we're going to have and say, because you're going to do this, you also have to do this. We can actually discuss the technology in context of the opportunities that it affords us to look after our environment. The second reason why I'm really looking forward to this is because we've got a great panel here. And one of the things is the representation that we have here. We have people from industry, government, we've got a farmer, and Peter will be here. And I almost forgot, we've got an online scientist as well. Scientist, obviously, I'm a scientist by training, so we should have them present here. I will introduce the people first, and then I will ask you to do your presentations in the order. So first, we have Kulani Machaba. He's the regulatory leader of Corteva Agri-Sciences, the Africa Middle East region. Kulani has more than 20 years experience in the agricultural sector, seed regulatory affairs, and he's a long-standing member of the South African National Seed Organization, or SANSO as we know it. And then he was also recently elected as the new president of the African Seed Trade Association. After Kulani, it will be Barney Korpe. Barney is the director of biodiversity and risk management in the biodiversity and conservation branch at the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. And his current portfolio covers global changes issues that include climate change, the theme that we discussed earlier, and then biological invasions. Welcome, Barney. And then online we have Chris Darik. I don't know if Chris can hear us or somebody can. At the USDA Agricultural Research Services, the Appalachian Fruit Research Station in West Virginia in the USA. His research focuses on the genetic improvement of fruit crops using advanced genomic and breeding technologies, specifically addressing major challenges affecting orchard productivity, cold injury, fruit quality, and other emerging threats. And then last but not least, it's Dani Bester. Dani is a commercial farmer who farms with maize, soybean, commercial beef master cows on his farm. The farm is called Rietbult in Balfour, Mpumalanga. He is he impressively makes use of technology on his farm and involved in international collaborations and research, mostly on soybean. And then just again, Peter Phillips again will join us. So if there's any questions that is carried over from the previous session, and obviously Peter is going to make contribution to this discussion. So as I said, we're looking forward to talking about promoting environmental stewardship through agricultural biotechnology. And Kulani, if I can ask you to start with your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Henny, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to share, let me just get myself sorted out here. I'm going to share 3 points with you this afternoon. One is looking at overall stewardship management, what it entails from an environmental stewardship management perspective. Secondly, the value of having good stewardship programs. And lastly, bring it home and share some practical experiences from challenges as well as opportunities that we face in South Africa from an environmental stewardship management of biotech trades. So stewardship management involves looking at management of biotech trades from the time of discovery right until the time that the products are discontinued. And as you can see on the slide, immediately we have a biotech trade getting into the discovery phase, which is usually about 7 or 8 years before it gets into the market. The stewardship programs are already put into place. So, in terms of why it matters, the value for us as the industry as well as the farmers. The important part is once the trades now get into the market, sometimes we have challenges of low-level presence that can sometimes impact trade. So it's very important from a technology developer's point of view to work with the growers to make sure that we have strong systems in place that can enable us to avoid those kind of issues. Secondly, also to get food and feed import clearances in various countries that we are trading with to ensure that if there is any possibility of commingling, the trades are cleared from a food and feed safety perspective. Thirdly, we have realized that involvement of the industry and the farmers in joint training programs really helps the growers to look at the durability of the trades by monitoring resistance development at much an earlier stage, and then we're able to put remedial action programs that let the trades to be durable, and we get the benefits of having the trades in the market for longer. So now I come to the last point, which is about what are we doing in South Africa to promote environmental stewardship. We are organized in South Africa under different industry associations, including CropLife, as well as South African National Seed Trade Association, to try and combine or harmonize the stewardship programs that different companies implement. Because stewardship is not seen as a competitive issue. It's for the benefit of everyone, the farmers, the technology developers, and also other key stakeholders that include the regulatory authorities. So in South Africa, we implement the refuge crop strategy when we cultivate various kinds of traits. There's resistance monitoring by the growers and also the industry. Various companies employ contractors who go and check on compliance and give advice to the growers if they are not complying so that they can be able to comply with the regulations as set by the authorities. Lastly, in cases of insect resistance management, there are remedial action programs that include spraying of pesticides in situations where the traits are not performing in a satisfactory manner. On the crop protection side, there is also the issue of herbicide-tolerant traits. What is being done in South Africa currently is monitoring the weed resistance development for various herbicides that are used for herbicide-tolerant crops. And in cases where there is those kind of instances, we start to detect them, we encourage crop rotation and alternative use of different herbicides. That necessarily meant that we change the program and stop growing the biotech traits in that particular area. So those are some of the examples of practical situation of what is being done by the industry. So for the challenges and opportunities, one of the greatest challenges that we have is compliance. So early on when the traits were introduced in South Africa, various surveys were done. It was shown that when the traits were introduced about 15, 20 years ago, the level of compliance in terms of planting refuge crops was low, at about 70, 75%. But recently it has gone up. It's just over 90% across the industry. But our target is to have 100% compliance. That's why I highlighted this as a challenge. The other part that is a unique challenge is that there's a lot of smallholder growers that are coming up and they need the traits. They see the benefit of planting the traits. But sometimes they are beneficiaries of the government seed support programs. And in the government seed support programs, the seed is purchased as a bulk seed. And the farmers then take the seed and subdivide it amongst themselves. So it's very difficult sometimes for the seed provider to keep track of all the growers that are planting that seed and to visit them and go and train them in their farms on what to do in order to improve in terms of compliance. But linked to that are opportunities. So what we are now doing as the industry is to focus on partnerships with farmer associations. So in all communities, the farmers are usually organized, even those that are beneficiaries of the government seed support programs. So we go and meet the leaders and ask them to rally all the farmers together, and we do training in group situations rather than trying to pick up individual farmers. So that helps a lot, because in those community or group setup meetings, other issues beyond stewardship come up that can be agronomic issues, agronomic challenges, challenges in terms of using pesticides, or various other agricultural challenges. And that partnership really helps to take the industry forward, as it's an information sharing session. Lastly, public-private partnerships are very critical. And one of the major agricultural research organization, a national one in Africa, is the Agricultural Research Council. And the ARC has partnered with a lot of companies in this area. And we find that to be extremely helpful, because the ARC is doing a lot of work, particularly with smallholder farmers. So those public-private partnerships are for the benefit of everyone when it comes to stewardship management. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kulani. Barney, can you please
Thank you.
continue? Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to be sharing with you this afternoon from an environment perspective. I'm from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. Let's see if this works. So I want to begin by acknowledging the environment sector as a sphere that is it's got components that are interconnected, and it happens to be a sphere that has seen a number of activities that are impacting on it in the Anthropocene era. And these, in summary, include land use change, direct exploitation of species, and climate change. We've heard a lot about it this morning. Pollution, invasive species, some people call them biological invasions. Climate change stands out because it's not only one of the global change challenges of the 21st century, but it also is a compounding factor on the other global change challenges, because it's going to somehow amplify most of these, basically going into the future. And at the same time, our country actually happens to be one of the, or ranked amongst the 17 mega biodiverse nations. But not only that, we also have 3 of the 35 hotspots of biodiversity around the world. So we've got a range of species from animals to plants. So that's very important to us to make sure that whatever changes that occur in this sphere, we have a good understanding, or at least we improve our understanding over time in terms of these possible new interactions, if there are any. So then, the Greek biotech, it's welcome, but as I mentioned earlier on, for us, there are a number of things that are of interest as a way of improving our understanding of any potential or possible relationship between a Greek biotech as well as the environment. And these include possibilities of gene flow to related species, potential for persistence and invasiveness, any direct and indirect impacts on non-target organisms, consequences of changes in agricultural practices, and the development of insect resistance and weed resistance. But maybe just to add, and not to labor this point, because I think we've heard a lot about this and how the technology is beginning to contribute towards aspects of nitrogen-based fertilizer use as a way of introducing nitrogen efficiency. To us, we welcome the fact that there has been changes in practices due to the introduction of these technologies to reduce carbon emissions. But nitrogen is one other greenhouse gas emissions, another source of greenhouse gases that are nitrogen-based. So we'd like to see improvement in terms of nitrogen use efficiency as well as water use efficiency, because from an environment perspective, there is that relationship between carbon reduction as well as increase in water use efficiency. So that's critical going forward, especially in the context of a country that we've heard earlier on that it's ranked amongst the countries with a low rainfall. So then we are part of a regulatory framework in South Africa. So our contribution here is, as I've mentioned earlier on, to assess the performance of these technologies from an environment perspective. So, and our work really is informed by research. So research is pivotal. And these are some of the examples that we've done previously, so that we help improve our understanding in terms of the potential or possible interactions. And that enables us to regulate this space appropriately and as informed by science. And risk assessment is also an important process, which is part of our regulatory framework. So we work with the South African National Biodiversity Institute, which contributes significantly through monitoring of these technologies and with a constant reporting, so that if there is a need, we adjust the policy or regulation accordingly from the perspective of the environment. And in closing, I just wanted to summarize the key measures for environmental regulation. In other words, what informs our regulatory approach. Legislation that is robust and informed by science, it's key. Climate change is an important issue, and we are constantly mainstreaming it into our regulation. And our approach really is more to assist the technology users rather than that of penalizing people. So that is why we see stewardship programs as complementing our efforts as regulators in this space. And therefore, we also develop guidelines and where possible, standard operating procedures that assist technology developers and users based on science, as I've mentioned earlier on. And also research, as I've mentioned, is key. Monitoring, critical, but not monitoring only, evaluating things, and also reporting through the various platforms, and stakeholder interaction is critical. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barney. The next presenter is going to be Chris, who's going to join us online from West Virginia.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So I don't know if I have control of my slides, so I might have to ask someone to change them for me. I'm, as you said, with the United States Department of Agriculture, and I work at one of our many research facilities, and our focus is on fruit crops. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today from the perspective of a biotech developer and talk about some of the ways we're looking to approach both climate change and improved environmental stewardship and reduce environmental impacts of our farming systems. So next slide, please. So, and if you click, some pictures will come up, but when you think about fruit and orchard systems, we have many challenges with these. And one of the things that we're focused on is trying to improve both the productivity and the production practices, the sustainability of them with regard to chemical and water inputs, as well as climate response. So we've been running breeding programs for a number of years and also have implemented biotechnology as a component of that to find solutions for specific problems. So when it comes to fruit crops, these are very different from many of our field crops. One is they're vitally important for nutrition, so they make an important part of human diets. However, they're often grown in very, I would say, defined areas. So for example, in the US, many of our fruit and nut crops are grown in the Central Valley of California and then distributed and shipped across the country. And that's a common practice because they often have very particular environmental needs. So one is they're perennial, so they're grown year after year. They're also propagated vegetatively, not from seed. So that creates some challenges in terms of when you're looking at biotech solutions. They're big and they require lots of water and chemical inputs. So spraying an orchard often requires a lot of chemical, and we'd like to reduce that if possible. Where we are in West Virginia, it's a temperate climate, so many of these crops require a period of dormancy that's typically cold induced. So that also creates challenges. In the face of climate change, we're seeing changes in the climate zones in which we can grow them, and so that's something I'll touch on as well. And lastly, the fruit are often very perishable, so they don't ship very well or store very well. They have particular needs in those regards. So there's a lot of challenges in trying to maintain sort of a food system and maintain our food security while minimizing the environmental effects of intensive agriculture. So one area that we focused on is plant architecture. So why is plant architecture important? Well, it is actually critical for the productivity of the system and the environmental impacts. So for example, horticulturally, with many of these crops, and you see in the lower left, that's a peach orchard being pruned. These trees are managed through labor-intensive practices to optimize light capture and fruit quality. The light penetration is important for the fruit. It impacts the efficiency of the trees in terms of transpiration and water use, the access to water and nutrients. So typically rootstocks are used. So the top of the tree is grafted onto a special rootstock that's been bred for its ability to access water and nutrients. And then also tolerance to drought and flooding, which is obviously influenced by that as well. From an agronomic standpoint, these systems are often labor intensive, and like I mentioned, require a lot of chemical inputs, a lot of water, and have often relatively low productivity. So in the lower right, you'll see this is a modern high-density apple orchard in the US, where you can see these are grown more as almost 2D fruiting walls than freestanding trees. And this is the kind of thing that we want to enable because there's much higher productivity. You can produce more food on less land with fewer chemical inputs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some examples of kind of some of the traits that we're trying to introduce into various crops. So one of these that we discovered we call TAC1, which actually stands for tiller angle control. It was first identified in rice, and it was actually bred into rice for having this very upright, compact shape. It had also been bred into maize for similar reasons, that the upright leaf angles and the upright tillers allowed you to plant at high density and improve light capture under those crowded conditions. So we've been able to target this gene and reproduce this in things like tomato and plum. And in the next slide, you'll see, so these are GE plums that have this gene knocked down, and now we can create plum trees that have shapes much more amenable to these high density production systems where we can essentially grow them in these fruiting walls, essentially. Next slide. There's genes that do the opposite. And one of the things that you'll see here as I go through these slides is that these gene targets are transferable across many plant species. So there are many changes or targets that we can go after with both gene editing and traditional GE approaches to make some of these introduce some of these traits into crops, especially where they don't already exist. So this is one that does the opposite in that it produces branches that are very horizontal in orientation. So for example, in plum, we found that we can train these to wires or produce very low growing systems, almost like grapes, which again require less inputs than say a freestanding orchard of trees. Next slide, please. Many of these genes also impact leaf angles. So the ability to manipulate leaf angle is critical, again, for growing trees under high density and allowing efficient light capture and minimizing, improving water use efficiency, I should say. Next slide. Underneath the ground, we also have gene targets now to manipulate rooting. Rooting depth in particular is one that we're after. So this gene called deeper rooting 1, we've been able to manipulate it to produce trees or rootstocks with deeper root systems. So this allows the plant to access water in deeper soil layers and is more drought resilient. We can also influence the root angle to change potentially the anchorage of the plant in the soil. Next slide. One last gene in terms of architecture, we call weep. So this was found, most of you are familiar, I'm sure, with weeping trees. They're popular ornamental types. So the gene that was responsible for that, we were looking to use again to alter the canopy shape of fruit crops. But it turns out the same gene was found to be involved in rooting depth and rooting shape in barley. So again, just illustrating that many of the gene targets, what we learn from one system is often transferable to another crop. But it's not generally easy to do that through traditional breeding. Biotech offers a much faster and more precise way of doing this. Next slide. So an area that we're also very focused on, again, in the face of climate change, is the ability to manipulate plant dormancy and bloom time. So with perennial crops, we see changes in bloom dates, and this is particularly causes particular problems in regard to things like frosts and freezes. Currently in our region, we experience warmer winters, and we get periods of warmth that will cause the trees to bloom, say weeks before they normally would. That usually is followed by a cold snap, and we get frost and freezes, and we lose the crop. So the ability to target this and manipulate it will allow us not only to overcome some of these potential impacts from climate change, but also to expand the production ranges. And this, again, is important for sustainability, because if we can produce crops more locally and in many different areas, we can maintain a secure food system and also, again, minimize some of the environmental impacts. Next slide. So one of there's a set of genes that we found that you can use to actually manipulate dormancy and bloom time. So in this picture, you'll see on the left, they're both peach trees. And on the left is a tree that where these genes have been removed and you lose dormancy. So these peaches are actually now grown in subtropical regions down in Florida and other regions in the US, where you normally wouldn't grow peaches, but these can be grown because they don't have that cold requirement anymore. They can be produced in areas they couldn't before. Next slide. And so using biotech approaches, we can actually manipulate these genes. Again, this is an example in plum, and you can see the trees on the left have a different sort of requirement for chill than the trees on the right. So we found that we can actually manipulate this to engineer design crops for specific climates, which is something that would be really powerful technology these days. Lastly, I just want to talk about a couple other areas that we're focused on. Again, this idea that we need to nearly double our food supply over the next couple decades, and we have shrinking land availability. So how can we address this problem, not just through architecture and using conventional farming, but are there other maybe more innovative solutions. So one of those, go to the next slide, is the rise of controlled environment agriculture or indoor farming. So in the US, we've seen tremendous growth in this industry. In fact, it's the fastest growing ag sector in the US. And these companies are building essentially indoor, fully controlled farms. The advantages of them is that there's little or no chemical inputs, so they don't use pesticides, and they're highly productive, so they can produce a lot of food. The downsides are, one, they're energy intensive, and the other is that currently they're limited to growing mostly leafy greens. So can you use such systems to produce the whole range of food? And so one of those, one of the areas we're working on is to address this. So can we engineer, for example, a plum tree to be compatible with an indoor farming system? And so this is one example. These are plums we had developed actually to facilitate breeding, but they're also now being used for indoor farming. And so we're trying to develop varieties. Again, these are small, they flower continuously, they don't have a dormancy requirement, they set fruit continually, and we can manipulate the flowering by temperature. So, what this kind of shows is that you can use biotechnology to dramatically change the way we grow and produce some of these crops to, again, make them more environmental sustainable. And then the last thing is a project we've been working on in the Appalachian region where we're located, which has been subject to a severe amount of coal mining, mostly mountaintop removal mining. And so not only has that produced over 1 million acres of land that is now really not really usable and has a negative environmental footprint, but it's now flat. So we've been looking at the potential to use such marginal lands to expand our farm acreage. And so one of the ways we can do that is to develop crop rootstocks, like apple rootstocks, that specifically are for production on some of these marginal soils. So in the last slide, you'll see some pictures of an orchard that we've developed in partnership with the West Virginia National Guard on one of these mine sites, and using a combination of soil amendment strategies and genetics, we can actually produce productive orchards on these previously unused lands. And so with that, I will stop.
The discussion. And then last, Donnie, to give us a perspective from a farmer's point of view. Thanks.
Oh, that's it. Thank you. I don't know what's left to say after all the speakers have told their stories today. There's one question that I hope someone would ask it, and maybe, with the promise of Ag Biotech, when are we going to get, like a crop or a gene that's maybe farmer-proof? That one little solution to all our problems, that'll be nice, yeah. So, I farm give me some background. I farm about 2 hours away from here. I farm mainly with corn, soybeans, and sunflowers, and some winter wheat the last few years. It's past 4 o'clock. My English might run out sometime. So, we also have a commercial beef herd that we do weaner production. I follow a regenerative way of farming with giving a lot of attention to try to restore the soil to what they should have been natively. And so we've done away with plowing. If we have to plow, we'll do it at night when nobody can see. So we are constantly trying to improve the soil on which we farm, because if the soil's not there, nothing on top is going to matter. No amount of tech will sort that out. Yeah. And then we aim for a lot of, for sustainability in the long run. Even though each season has its own ups and downs, we can't approach each season the next one like this one. Like this year, we had 1,400 millimeters of rain, where we usually have only 680 millimeters on long-term average. So the approach we have with the technology, well, I'm also one of the early adopters of technology from quite a few years ago, precision farming. I try to farm centimeter by centimeter, or the smallest amount that I can. I feel I'm more in control, and I'm not doing wasting anything, because on my farm we give a lot of attention to effectiveness. So where does the biotechnology fit in on my operation? So we use Roundup Ready corn and soybeans that we use in the production system. It's really an excellent tool for us in managing grass, especially, and in the weeds in our herbicide program. The reason for that is we don't need to use any harsher chemicals that is available on in the market, and that really sometimes, and from personal experience, I've seen that sometimes if you have to go the conventional route with some of the harsher chemicals, you'll run into some yield suppression, and that's something that I don't want. And also the Roundup Ready technology, it is the moving away from the conventional way of farming, from plowing the day, going over to reduced tillage, and then over to the regenerative ag practices that we are doing today. And then the BT corn that we use to plant, that's one of the big things where we plant corn on corn. We have to manage those corn borders. They overwinter in the residues, and when they wake up, they're like me. They just want to eat, and then they'll eat a big amount of your yield potential. And the nice thing of biotech like that is we don't have to use really hard chemicals that destroys all of the other beneficials that we want to sustain and attract to fight off other pests. Yeah. And we're not using any really harmful insecticides or pesticides that might even pollute the drinking water and so forth. Yeah. And another thing, from even like the BT corn, we don't get any grading problems because if your corn is being attacked by pests, a corn plant, if it's not healthy, it's not producing the way it should, it won't reproduce, and you'll get a downgrade on the quality, and you wouldn't get the full price for that product. Then another thing that I'm really excited about is the new Intacta soybeans that we're going to get here. I've been fortunate enough to test some of those varieties last season, and I must say, just by the improvement, I think from the Roundup Ready 2 gene that we're getting, together with the resistance to the bollworm, that's going to be like the easiest half ton a hectare, I think, yield improvement that most of the producers should get if you apply that technology correctly, because of the fact that I think I know a few things about soybeans. I think most guys know it. The more pods and flowers you retain, the higher your yield will be, and that's just one of the things that we're going to get from using that technology that is going to be available to us, and also less chemicals that we need to control those bollworms. Then something I would like to mention as well. I'm a big driver. One of my hobbies is trying to see how much yield I can get out of corn and soybeans. I hold the unofficial world record for the most amount of pods on a soybean. That's 2,044 pods. And one of the things that I've seen is that we need to use biotechnology or any type of technology that is available to us in the agricultural industry, even with PGRs and stuff, so that we cannot just only use the advantage from the genetics that we get, but we must be able to express the maximum amount of yield we can get out of those varieties and technologies that is there. So it's not just like a one systems approach. It's more like a collective approach from all of the technologies that we have to use. The impact that it had, and I think just not only in my farming operation, but I think in maybe all of my neighbors and everyone that is adopting these technologies, we always get positive yield gains, but only if you use that technology for the aim that it was created for. And I think one of the things is to stay within the legal requirements, the prescribed regulatory things that there is, planting the zones in which they should be planted and stuff like that. Yeah, we're also getting lower input costs because usually, if you have to go the conventional way, if you have to use some of the old techniques and spray a lot of insecticides and stuff like that, it usually you get to a point, especially nowadays with the high input prices, that it's not as economical as just going with the all in the bag included biotech that we're getting. Yeah. The good ROI that we're getting from it isn't always just a financial thing. It's we in the no-till regenerative way, just by using this biotech on our farm, in long term we're increasing the amount of the amount of life in soil, the water holding capacity, and all those nice things that go with it. So it's not just a financial thing, but it's more like a good return on soil health and promoting the sustainability of not fighting Mother Nature, but farming with Mother Nature, because you will lose if you try to fight her. We farm with water like you're actually a water farmer here in South Africa. The yields you're getting from grain is just a byproduct. And then it makes the management a whole lot easier. It's just the technology, it's there, whether it's agtech we're using or biotech, all the technology is there, but you have to get educated in how and where to apply all of that, because otherwise it's just some technology that's lying around. I've heard that, guys say, you have to know what you're doing, and you have to learn how to use it. And I must say, in my case, I also mentor some of the upcoming farmers, and it's usually for me personally as well. I like to learn from word of mouth from one of my other farmers, and I think the better the knowledge is about that, and the more it is distributed among farmers, I think the faster the adoption of that would be as well. Yeah, thank you. That's what I had to say. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, Donnie, and thank you for all the other presentations. I told you that it's going to be a wide range, an interesting range. So before I start, I just want to remind people that may be listening online in the chat box to drop your questions there. Somebody here will probably give them to me. And then the people here in the venue, please just raise your hands. I'm sure there's plenty of questions to be asked. Just shout if you need anything. And then just to get the ball rolling, I jotted down here enough to keep us busy for the rest of the evening, so I hope nobody's in a hurry. But I've heard two different things here. Stewardship, when Kulani started to talk, there's the things that we know, and I got to know the word stewardship when we started to talk about biotechnology or about biotechnology. So my first question to you, Kulani, is just stewardship in the absence of biotechnology. Yes. Is there something like that, or stewardship just about biotech trades and looking at new technology things? And before you answer then, I would like to, Barney, just to follow up on that and to say from your perspective then. So I just want to play off a little bit the whole concept about stewardship and, now these new technologies, we should look at them. And then there's a general thing, and I think some of the things that Donnie said relates to that. We have a general responsibility of being good stewards of the environment, and he as a farmer, specifically the environment there. So I just want to play those two things off against each other, please.
Yes, so definitely, yes, stewardship is much broader than agricultural biotechnology stewardship. It's about responsible use of agricultural products. It can be through farming practices. Even if we're using conventional crops, we can use certain farming practices that have adverse impact on the environment, and we try and minimize that. It's just that with agricultural biotechnology traits coming into commercialization, the industry took it to the next level. Hence the implementation of the Excellence Through Stewardship program, which is focusing more only on biotech traits. But when we discuss stewardship with the farmers, we're not focusing only on ag biotech.
Thank you so much. Barney, you?
So I'd like to concur with that. I mean, over time, we've learned that we need to change our relationship with the environment in general. So, the way we interact, consume, and so on. So clearly, it's a no-brainer that stewardship actually has to be an innate thing and it has to be part of our everyday, actions. And climate change is a very good example of how actually, through our activities, as we basically overlooked our relationship with the Earth system, how we contributed to the problem. And so now, as I said, over time we've learned, and we are starting now to change our ways to realize that, stewardship actually has to be part of our, daily lives and in everything that we do, basically. Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to add to what you say. I think, especially from your perspective as a custodian of the environment of South Africa in some form, at least, what you said obviously fits 100% with that, because you have a much wider responsibility than just the stuff within agriculture. But then in agriculture, and part of your introduction and where you work is invasives, for example, and all those things. So stewardship. I like the idea that we're discussing stewardship also in a broader context.
Yes.
That, the GM crops, for example, is not the exception to the rule. And then I want to follow up with this, and I'm just going to stay with them for a little while. But can you just explain to the people that are listening to, obviously we have a technology developer. One of the important aspects of the development of the product is that development of the biosafety data and ensuring that you have a sustainable product. You submit that, it goes in our system to a regulatory authority where they also assess that then.
Yes.
Is that assessment then a formal part of what, my question, and then I want to come down to who tells you what to check for stewardship? Because you mentioned things like herbicide tolerance, for example, and insect tolerance.
Yes.
But what about the other things? Where does the information come from that we need to focus on in terms of stewardship?
Okay, I will say the reference standard was what was developed a few years ago when biotech traits came into the market, the guidelines from the OECD Blue Book. So those set the standards for many companies to follow. But there is much more than what are minimum regulatory requirements that the companies are doing. So before we get to the commercialization phase, usually there's 10 years of research before the product is submitted for commercialization. And many products, as was explained earlier in the day, they don't make it because maybe those criteria that have been set for assessment of potential adverse impact on the environment, non-target species, it's not meeting the standard. Then the products get dropped. So there's a battery of tests that are done, and then those additional tests are then submitted to the regulatory authorities based on what the authorities need to see. But in most cases, additional data is submitted that shows adverse impact, that non-adverse impact on the environment, human health, animal health, and so on. So to summarize, there's the standard that's set by the regulatory guidelines, and there's the work that is being done privately in addition to that to support a particular application.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. And then, Barney, just quickly then, a follow-up question to you is, if you then, you refer to can you believe I forgot the word biodiversity? Can you believe it? Biodiversity. Biodiversity is obviously important things, and it's a basis of many things that you do. So how do we focus on what aspects? Because biodiversity is also a very broad term. And when I think of biodiversity, I think of exactly the pictures that you had in your slide, the floral kingdom and the Cape and things like that. But how do we get away from that broad kind of idea of, we just have to protect the environment to things that we can implement, that both the technology, because they are responsible now for this technology, and then the farmer in the end of the day, that they can translate into practice actually.
So I think that's a very good and an important question. I mean, this is a big and a complex space, the biodiversity space. So that's where now the science comes in terms of assisting us to identify what one would refer to as assessment endpoints, so that we are clear, because that enables us to be clear how we regulate, and so that the people who are regulated understand, they are regulated based on what, and the process is clearly defined to them. And so that because communication and understanding, sometimes it's where the issues come up and makes it difficult either for the regulator or for the person who's regulated. So development of assessment endpoints and measures such as risk assessment continuously are critical and key in making sure that the regulatory process is clear and people know what to do. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just quickly going to read off a question that we got online here. Marnus Gause, a question to Prof. Phillips, is what in your view is the future of glyphosate, and then it was added by Ben, and glyphosate in world agriculture?
Both chemicals are core part of the GM technology today, Roundup and Liberty. They're used quite extensively both with GM crops and in some cases as burn-off chemicals in non-GM circumstances. So they're part of the space, and they're a nice segue to this question of stewardship, because all chemicals have the potential to generate resistance or biotic responses in the spaces in which they're used. So part of stewardship is going beyond just, is it legal today and is it efficacious today, but to ensure the sustainability of the technology across its application and its use. So part of that's things like, in very practical terms that I've seen, companies or organizations working with companies will ensure that old seed is removed from the market, so that deregistered seed doesn't contaminate and degrade the quality of these chemicals. That the chemicals themselves, the bits that are not used and left in bins or in the bins, the barrels themselves are removed from the environment so that they're not damaging our water system. Management of refugia and other, which isn't related to these two chemicals, but to ensure that we don't create the resistance that will degrade the quality of these technologies. Resistance management is a big one, and the companies are working with the regulators and with the scientists to ensure that where we find the resistance building up, either in the intended organism or in weedy relatives or coexisting plants, that we figure out a pathway and figure out a mitigation strategy to ensure that the technology doesn't get out of control. I guess at the end of the day, part of it's coexistence. Parts of the world and parts of the marketplace are quite happy with products produced with those two chemicals. Other parts aren't. And it's not that one is right or one is wrong, but the sustainability of the industry is that that whatever parts you're in as a producer or as a consumer or anybody in between those two, that you're able to confidently and effectively and efficiently deliver what you want to deliver and what people want to use and consume.
I think towards the end you touched on a very important aspect. Of course, we're sitting here talking about environmental stewardship. But in the end of the day, these products are also in a bigger context in the market, things that you referred to earlier in your talk. So those are also important aspects. So even though we can focus a lot on the ensuring that the environment is protected or safe from the chemicals we use, it may not be the alpha and the omega of a particular technology or the use of the technology. I just quickly want to make sure that Chris can hear me, because I'm glad to see you still there. I've got a question for you. Often when we have a discussion about biotechnology, and its ability to enable, for example, the planting, you gave an example there of looking at dormancy and peaches. I think you used that example, and you said now people can plant it in Florida as well. So what we would then often hear from people that focus on the environment is that they say, but now you're going to take up even more hectarage for agriculture. What would your answer be to a statement like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about the sustainability of and the security of our food systems, so it's easy to just assume that it's static, that we can keep producing what the crops we're growing, where we're growing them. And the reality is, as we move forward into the future, we're probably not. So in California, for example, they have huge water problems now. So all these tree and nut crops they grow, they're not going to be able to continue to grow at that scale unless they solve the water problem, which is maybe a bigger challenge. So I think there's tremendous value in diversification. So having our crops produced in different places in different ways, more local production, at scales where people are also more connected to their food. I think that the industrialization of the system, in some ways, many consumers, they're just not as connected as they used to be in terms of where our food comes from. So I'm a big proponent of that kind of diversification. And what it's probably going to take to address some of these huge challenges that we have to ensure that in the future we're producing enough food in a way that's environmentally sustainable and economically sustainable.
Thank you so much. I think what I like to highlight from your answer is that these technologies, and not the technology, but the innovations in the products are context specific. I mean, you gave us very nice examples of all the different work that you're doing, but you can't generalize any of those things. Like the example I just tried to sketch with my question is that you're not just going to increase it, but the counterpoint of that is that it's local production. And one of the things that Chris actually referred to initially in his discussion is looking at the whole food system. You can also not just think of stewardship and just focus on the farm the whole time and say, you should do everything there, but then you load these things in huge trucks and you transport them across the country. It doesn't make sense. Looking at the whole system. And I think, so the bottom line of the whole discussion is that products, in the end of the day, this context specificity is very important. We can't just generalize, say there's high production in this area will be, the answer to everything. And then quickly, I want to ask a question to Dani, and it may be a little bit of a weird one starting off with, but I want to ask if you're the exception to the rule, because you spoke about regenerative farming. You said it's important to repair the soil condition to where it was, yonks ago. And one of the things that frustrates me often is when you also talk to people about farming in general. I'm not even just talking about genetic or biotechnology type of things. Is people have this idea that farmers just, are chasing every rand. So starting off by first, are you different? Or is there a different kind of attitude towards farming? When did this start? This perception, if I'm correct, when did it start, and kind of how do you see it? What is the message that you want to give to the general public, basically, in terms of a farmer, in terms of how you look at the environment and how you farm with the environment?
Yeah, I think I am. I might be the exception to the rule. I think a lot of people think when you're talking to a guy that says, yeah, he's doing regenerative type stuff, it's like, there's no technology. You have to go back to like the native soils. In those years there weren't any technology and any chemicals done like that. But it's not like that. I think in today's time, I'm one of those guys that if I have to go no-till and improve soil quality and I have to use technology and or any type of biotech that's available to me, then I'm going to do it, yeah. Because a lot of times, I think also because of the lack of knowledge by a lot of people, not knowing what's going on a farm, they won't know that a lot of this new type of technologies and stuff that we do have, it's a safer way and a quicker way of returning or improving. I don't think we'll ever get the soils to what they was, but that is it's a faster, safer way just to get the soils back, hopefully into a more productive, sustainable way that it was like in previous times, yeah. So and I think. There's sometimes, it's like if there's like a type of a thing added, like if you're going if you're farming in a certain way, there are a set of rules that you have to attend to, yeah, and you can't steer away from them. And that's one of the biggest things I think in farming, that there's no white paper or no anything set of rules. You have to adapt, and if you can't adapt to that, even if it sometimes means breaking the rules or moving out of the rules, if you're not going to do that, you won't be farming for long, yeah.
Just to follow up on that, I just got another question online from Dave Berger that asks, how do you monitor the soil quality on your farm over the long term?
That is over long term. We have to do soil tests, and I think soil test is like the technical way of looking at it. But I think also financially, if you're not doing some things correctly, it won't reflect financially. But yeah, looking at what the yields were a few years ago to where we are now, the amount of kilograms we are producing per millimeter of rain, and precision farming really made a lot of that, keeping record on a lot of that stuff, made it really easy to see if you're making any progress or not. Yeah. So the more data, I'm a data farmer, the more data that I can collect on my farm and analyze it and look at it to see if I'm going forward, because if you're going forward, a lot of times it will be because of the soils that you are improving. So all of the results that you're getting is a result from what's going on in your soils.
Thank you so much. Bonnie, I'm coming back to you because I've got two questions here that relate to government policy. So the first one is not really a question. I think it's a statement more by Ntakadzeni Nsidada that suggests that we need a regional meeting and a discussion about the potential of and how we're going to utilize kind of my own interpretation of this is developing like a regional policy for the use of biotech to talk to the climate crisis. And then the second one relates in the same context, I would say, a question from Ben that asks what is being done to create an enabling regulatory environment for products of genome editing. In the context, I would assume that this may be one of the technologies that we can address the climate change. So they're putting you on the spot here, but it's about the policy environment.
And it's deliberate for that matter, both of them. So I think I fully concur with the need for a regional, one could call it regional engagement strategy, which we have in place to mobilize our neighbors as well, in the context of this technology, but from an environment perspective as well, given other international developments like, the supplementary protocol on liability and, so I think that's important. But mainstreaming climate change into that, of course. So that actually ensures consistency in the region, and it also, contributes to issues of trade as well, with our neighbors, and make sure that things are seamless, and there's a sort of strategy that possibly nudges us towards a policy that harmonizes things in the region. So I think arguably, well, I mean, this is a relatively, and I'm careful here, new technology from, the environment perspective, because, we are learning, and that is why we actually have made it a point that research is pivotal for us to guide us, properly in terms of how do we regulate things from from an environment perspective. So I think in time, things will evolve because we are in a space that is not static. It's constantly evolving. So it has to evolve as guided by science, which is our best tool that is available to us. So, yeah, I'm positive that as time evolves, things will evolve and we'll get there. Yeah.
I think while you answering the question, I'm reminded of the slides that we saw in the first session, where our big export markets are, especially when we talk about foods. So the first place, climate impact is going to be a regional thing. It's not going to be stopped by borders.
Right.
The second place is that there's almost a responsibility. If you are, this is my personal view, but there's a responsibility if you are able to utilize and people are actually depending on you for their imports to ensure, it's not only us that's going to be affected by that.
Right.
Our close neighbors in the region are going to be impacted by it. So it just makes a lot of sense for me that this is the type of discussion that should obviously be done on a regional basis. And I forgot to look up. Is there any questions? There's one at the back there, please, and there's another one.
Sorry.
So we'll start with Ben, then we'll come back to you. Hi, Bongani, I see it's you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Testing? Test. No. Great. I just wasn't talking. Thanks very much. Really interesting panel discussion. One question and a comment more to our remote speaker, the virtual speaker. The mine dump kind of rehabilitation or reutilization. We have a lot of mine dumps, at least in this province of South Africa, and the problem with their use is heavy metal uptake. So I'm just wondering, that obviously must have been an issue. I don't know if you had experience with that, of heavy metal uptake into your crop plants. And then the comment is, Dr. Groenewald, our moderator, and I attended a conference a few years ago where I was advocating that given the changing developments in the world and climate change and everything else, biotechnology is not really a luxury anymore. It's becoming a necessity. But the line I suggested was that we should stick to domesticated crops and animals. At that very conference, there was a presentation on Lyme disease in the US, where I think it's a rat-borne disease in ticks from rats. The presentation was on modifying the rats to be resistant somehow. Sorry, I don't recall the detail. So already there was talk on how the wild populations needed to be changed. I would just like to get a reflection on how far are we willing to go with biotech applications into our environmental side of things. In other words, not the domesticated crops. And surely open discussion on this, the transparency that needs to happen. Any comment on that?
Chris, please.
Sure. So I think I can comment quickly on both your questions. So the first one about heavy metal uptake, yes, that is one of the things that we're really looking at. So, and we're working with a apple rootstock breeder, and one of the things he's found is that the ability to uptake these various metals and nutrients is genetic. So there's the potential that we could identify, for example, and utilize rootstocks that simply don't take up some of these heavy metals or take them up very inefficiently. And that's really what we're after. And so that's one of the really great things about tapping into plant genetic resources is their ability to do this. Another way we're looking at this is using wild apple species that grow in really marginal lands. And they have the natural ability to grow and be productive under poor nutrient conditions. So the genetics exist. It's just doing the research and finding the right combinations to create crops that will be productive in the systems that you're trying to design them for. In terms of the second question about, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, it escaped me now. What was the
I will remind him if you can just, I don't think can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
I think the second question related to environmental engineering almost, and engineering or changing wild populations like gene drives.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, so a real great example that we have here in the US is actually the American chestnut tree. So the chestnut trees back in the 30s, if you're not familiar with this, in the 1930s were essentially wiped out by invasive fungus. And they were, where we live in the Appalachian region, they were 90% of the forests, and they're really gone. And so group, American Chestnut Foundation, developed a GE solution. So these chestnut trees are completely resistant to the fungus, and they are currently have an application pending with the USDA and EPA in the US to essentially release those back into the forests, because those trees are really critical to support native wildlife. So they're the nuts and stuff they produced is what many of the fauna lived off of. And so what's been replaced with that is many invasive tree species, non-native tree species, I should say. So yeah, we're looking to really go back almost 100 years potentially to what our forests look like then. And the impacts of that, it's a huge question that I think regulators and society in general have to make some tough decisions on.
Thank you so much. Can I please just ask Peter Bongani, I know you're waiting, but just give it time, Peter, and then Barney, just to also throw in comments about
There's
engineering.
lots of examples people have been using about ways they might be able to use genetic manipulation to influence the environment. We've got one that I think gets close to what you're asking about. One of my other jobs is I'm a chairman of a small funding agency that invests in genetic applications. And in North America, we have a thing called the buffalo. It's a bison, a North American bison. The natural herds were wiped out pretty much. There are still bison populations, but they intermingled with cattle. And so they're a hybrid of cattle and the original bison, and they're diseased. They have brucellosis and bovine TB. And when they get close to cattle, they spread the disease into cattle and can cause epidemics. And right now they're isolated. So that right now there is a project that was just funded working with the indigenous population and scientists to see if they can, A, clean the disease out of the herd, because some of the herds are more resistant. They built up a natural immunity to the disease. So by using more AI to spread the disease-resistant animals, but secondly then to see if they can selectively work towards cleaning out some of the more pernicious parts of the cattle genome out of the plant just by selective breeding. So they're not GM in the sense that they're going to transgenically modify, but it's very much an environmental rehabilitation program to clean up the population and then to see if they can return it closer, a bit like our land, return it a bit closer to its natural state. So there's examples like that spread throughout the science community, I think.
Again, you highlight that it's not just about the technology. You can do things in different ways with similar impacts. Barney, just from your side, I do not expect you to come up with a policy decision, but this environmental, obviously it's a huge impact.
Yeah.
And maybe in your answer, just refer to, maybe not just the assessment, but looking at environmental impact. What's the other one?
Yeah,
Impact.
look, I mean, I think there's an example here in South Africa that, presents, call it an opportunity here to test the if the biotech, the biotechnology can contribute. We've got a bug that's it's known as the polyphagous short hole borer. That's killing trees, and it threatens the avocado industry and possibly other orchards, So it just gets into the tree trunk and then, bores a hole. It's carrying a fungus, I think. There's that relationship. And then the tree dies, over time. And the concern is that it's spreading now throughout the country. And so the worry again for us is what will happen if it gets into the conservation areas, because then it's a big problem because that's an ecosystem and a neat food chain in there. So we've got a couple of people looking at it, understanding the biology of the, bug itself and so on. So I think it's an opportunity there to see if, biotech can make an intervention, to assist, in that. So it's again like in the biological invasion space, but there's that connection now with biodiversity as well. So, yeah. And I mean, that's the approach that we advocate from an environmental perspective, that these days with so much knowledge and science out there, I think we are in a space, a position where our approach needs to be what one would call a nexus approach of these things, Otherwise, challenges will pile up and we will never actually, gain any ground in terms of addressing these 21st century challenges.
Purely out of personal interest, the shot borer that you referred to, is there any indication that it may relate to changing climate, or is it too early to say that?
Very good question. I'm not aware of any studies at the moment, but I think what we are picking up is we're beginning to understand pathways of introductions in certain geographical locations in the country. That's the next step, actually, to look at, let's model it. Once we understand the biology, to say, okay, where is it going to spread more and what sort of impact is likely to have and under what specific conditions, because we have a very good sense of how climate change is going to play out nationally in terms of both temperature increase. Rainfall is hard to like sort of pin down accurately, but we get a sense of what's going to be the rainfall regime, roughly, going forward.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Question, please.
Just by starting with, my name is Bongani. I am from Bayer. Maybe just by starting with an opening statement, just to reflect that, over the past few years, we have seen, an invasion of insect pests such as fall armyworm. We've seen invasion by, some of the invasive weed species. Pulmonary alta is one of them. And what I want to ask you, Bani, is that, South Africa has a long history of use of biotech, and we're surrounded by countries that either have biosafety regulation or non-existent biosafety regulations. And if we were to tackle some of these challenges, obviously there's a need for a regional approach of regional harmonization of these laws, as we've seen in other parts of Africa. But there seems to be a challenge within SADC in particular. But what surprises me is that, for seed regulatory laws, there's harmonization. But what is, in your view, the challenge with harmonization of biosafety regulations within Southern Africa? Thank you.
And you aiming it at Barney.
Yeah. So I think the Wani's question takes us back to Ntakazani's input earlier on, which I pretty much agree that there definitely is a need for a regional initiative, and through the SADC office, because then it gives it impetus and good grounding if it's coordinated through the SADC office. So if you ask me, one of the challenges could be capacity, to drive it from from those SADC premises, basically. So, but things are changing. you have countries now. For instance, I was, with colleagues from Zambia, colleagues from Mozambique, and Namibia recently, who actually have begun initially. I mean, countries did not have any sort of policy or regulation in place in that regard, but now there's a start where they have regulation in place. And yes, issues will be maybe in the capacity for scientific research in the respective countries and so on, which is where SADC could come in and facilitate that using various platforms that exist. For instance, through the Department of Science and Innovation, we could use. There is a program through the National Research Foundation which has a footprint across the SADC. I'm forgetting it now. It's I don't know if Ben would remember this. It's called. It's about basically climate. It's mainly a climate change and land use initiative. So it's brought together scientists. I think the office is now located in Namibia. So there are those platforms that we can actually sort of latch on to and then build capacity slowly from a scientific perspective. But as South Africa, as I said earlier on, we have put together a regional engagement strategy, and it's with clear objectives that the first step is to engage. And part of engaging is actually talking about the science, unpacking the science so people understand the science, because the issue is right there. There's got to be a clear source of information that is reliable, that unpacks the science. And then once we all understand the science, we agree that, okay, given the science, then these are the steps that each one of us in the region needs to take. And then, the rest will follow in place. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I see we've got 2 minutes left. So before I conclude, I just want to circle around back to Kulani quickly. Right in the beginning, your first slide, you made this point about stewardship, and specifically now referring to biotech crops.
Yes.
It's from discovery all the way till the crop is taken off the market.
Yes.
So you know that there's been initially a lot of discussion, and there are some smaller seed companies that still talk about generics.
Yes.
Using old technology or old line and then putting into their own. What is your interpretation? What is the meaning of generics or not being able to generics in terms of stewardship issues?
When it comes to biotech traits, the biotech traits do get patented, and patents normally last for 20 years and they expire. So what usually happens after that is the difference between crop protection products as generics within the crop protection industry and within the biotech industry. It's the regulatory obligations. So usually, for example, give an example of South Africa. We get a conditional general release permit, which means every year there's certain reports you need to submit to prove that you have complied with those conditions. So that permit, there is a potential for it to be withdrawn if you don't comply. That is not linked to the patent. Yes. So that's why it's very difficult to have generic biotech products because of the regulatory obligations or the regulatory environment that governs biotech traits. So that's the major difference between the crop protection industry and the agricultural biotech industry.
Thanks. Yeah. That's clear. And that's it. According to my watch, the time is over. Thank you for the participation. Thank you for the presentations. I think I want to highlight something that Barney mentioned in his presentation. You referred to this collaborative approach that you have, and you refer to specific organizations. What I've heard today, Chris spoke about the products. The technology is developing. There's no way that we're going to stop it. There's a need for these things, and that's one of the reasons why it's driven that way. But there's a clear understanding and appreciation from technology developers, the current players. I think future players, hopefully, will be in the same boat. As they appreciate that they do not do this in isolation. They need to, take stewardship in the broader sense of the environment. Policy makers know about these things, they know about the potential things. It's not so easy as just, changing 2 or 3 words in a publication and then we have new systems, but at least there's an appreciation and we're going forward with this. I think the regional aspect is also an important one that we should not forget. Unfortunately, regional things, personally, I know I'm guilty of this, I always put it on the back burner because it's so difficult just to discuss the things internally. So adding the complexity of different territories is even more. And then ending off with the farmers. They need the technology, they will use the technology if it adds value to them. One of these values that technology may offer, and again, technology in the broad sense, it's not just about GM or genetic genome editing specifically. It's about any technology that can improve the way in which we do our agriculture, particularly in the current environment and the climate, in the figurative way as well, is where we need to look after our environment. And farmers will use that technology because at the end of the day, it's not only about the on-farm benefits of that, but it's about making a product that the consumer wants. So as long as we can talk to each other, I'm always the eternal optimist. We should get there. We must just talk to each other. And that's sometimes the frustration that we do not talk to each other. So I hope we leave you with some optimism about the technology and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I have to say that I echo so much of that optimism that you just expressed. Hearing the conversation today, I think it's very clear that there are so many opportunities to move agriculture forward, to have the right kinds of innovations, so that we're not just looking at, how we can ensure that these innovations aren't harmful to the environment, but even looking further and saying, okay, how can we start to use these innovations specifically to protect the environment and reduce the impact of, the conventional agriculture, because we all understand the problems, we're all very aware of them, and I think that there's such a need, such a desire to move agriculture forward so that it really is a sustainable system. And looking at climate change, there is no doubt that adaptation is going to be required. We're looking at how our weather patterns are changing. We're looking at floods and droughts and all of these things. And when Jack mentioned COVID-19, I don't know if that was a light bulb moment for anyone else, but looking at how we can't always anticipate all of the changes that are going to come our way, but creating a really agile environment, an agile regulatory space, an agile innovation space so that we can respond to those challenges. I think that we have so many of those change makers in the room, and I want to really thank everyone who has served on a panel today, our keynote speaker, our moderators, because you are those change makers. So thank you for all of the leadership that you give to this space. I think you've all discussed today that biotechnology is really going to be one of the tools. There's so many tools that we need as we're looking at creating sustainable agriculture. But it's so important. Looking at what sustainability means and how that features in our plans, we know that sustainability, according to the United Nations, is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And so we look at that both in terms of food security, but also in terms of the environment and how do we improve agriculture. And the presentation that Chris gave, where he was looking at these ways that we can really change agriculture so that it's using less land, so that it's using less water, so that we're really able to move forward as a sector, really inspires a lot of optimism. So thank you again to everyone who has participated, and thank you to everyone who has participated online. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Hopefully after this, there's going to be a slide that will pop up that will have some contact information for our office as well as CropLife. We hope that this is not the end of the conversation, but hopefully just the beginning. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any thoughts on how to continue this conversation. We would love to be a part of that. And we will also be bugging you with yet one more email to hopefully fill out a survey about your experience and how some of the panels may have influenced your thoughts about biotechnology in general. So looking forward to continuing that conversation with all of you online. And for those of you in the room, looking forward to continuing that conversation in a much more immediate sense because we have a reception waiting right outside. Thank you all. Good night. Really appreciate the conversation. Thanks.